Marvel's master of multiversal magic. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination, so don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like, and if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 1 Experimental Subject 757. Doctor, the test results for Subject 757 are on, what level? Level 2, meaning even with full development, he can only achieve superficial mind reading and control of no more than 50 kilograms of magnetism. Yes, Doctor, that's according to our current research data on mutants. It seems that fusing Professor X and Magneto's genes to create the strongest artificial mutant is indeed impossible. Let's end this experiment here. From now on, focus our research on X-24, he is our strongest weapon. Should we dispose of Subject 757 like the previous subjects, keep him with those kids for training. He's a fusion of Professor X and Magneto's genes. Even at level 2, proper development can still be useful. Yes, Doctor. 757, be decisive and ruthless. Attack my vitals. Don't hesitate, you piece of trash. On the training field, a muscular man wielding a dagger was launching a fierce attack on a 17 or 18-year-old youth. The young man used his abilities to manipulate the dagger for defense and parrying while trying to find an opportunity to counterattack with his fists. However, he was clearly not skilled enough and couldn't make good judgments. We both manipulate magnetism, but my control over magnetism is so inferior compared to Magneto's. The young man's name was Xiaozhi, a transmigrator who had transmigrated into the body of an artificial genetically modified mutant called Subject 757 3 months ago. His mutant abilities were mind reading and magnetic control. Unfortunately, his mind reading only had a chance of success when the other party was completely unprepared, and he could only read the current mental state, not the memories deep in the mind. His control over magnetism was even worse. At present, he could only control objects weighing less than 10 pounds. Although it wasn't bad if used well, it was worlds apart from Magneto's ability to lift an entire stadium and fly away at will. It was okay against ordinary people, but if he encountered someone with defensive abilities like the Thing, Colossus, or the White Queen, he wouldn't be able to break through their defenses. His current goal was to find a way to escape this cruel laboratory. A piercing ringtone sounded, and a staff member in a white coat entered, halting the training and placing a high-tech device around George's neck. Subject 757, it's time for dinner. Yes, George replied stiffly, then obediently followed a staff member out of the room. The device around his neck was called a mutant suppressor. Once worn, his abilities would completely disappear, turning him into an ordinary person. Normally, he had to wear this suppressor except during training and combat. Walking down the long corridor, besides him, many other mutants were being brought out of various training grounds by staff. However, they were much younger, appearing to be only 12 or 13 years old. The Marvel Universe, this is truly a dangerous world. Seeing this scene, George couldn't help but sigh. From the moment he learned he was a mutant, he knew he had entered the Marvel Universe. He knew a little about Marvel, having occasionally watched movies, though he wasn't a hardcore Marvel fan. As far as he knew, there were many universes in the Marvel Universe, and the stories in each universe were different, but one thing was certain. Few universes were peaceful. The disappearance of half the population of a universe, like Thanos' actions, wasn't too terrifying. The complete annihilation of an entire universe was also normal. But since he had already transmigrated here, he could only try to survive. Who would want to die if they could live? He was a person who cherished life, and if possible, he desperately wanted to live forever. Some people said that immortality was a curse, and watching those around them die one by one was extremely agonizing. But he felt that compared to the benefits of immortality, that small price was nothing. In the heart of a Chinese person, who doesn't want to cultivate immortality? Even after unifying the 6 kingdoms, Qin Shi Huang still sent his men to find the elixir of immortality. Based on his observations over the past month, he could now roughly confirm that the Marvel Universe he was in might have significant connections to the world of Logan. Because among these children, he saw the little wolf girl, an X-23, who, like Wolverine, possessed healing abilities and adamantium claws. What puzzled him was that the current time wasn't 2029 from the movie, but 2009. From the gossip among the staff, he learned that this universe also had Playboy Tony Stark and Captain America. According to the timeline of Logan, the little girl wouldn't even have been born in 2009, but the determined-looking little girl in front of him was clearly 12 or 13 years old. So this wasn't the mutant universe, nor the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but a Marvel universe he didn't know about. The timeline doesn't matter, as long as what's meant to happen happens. Whether it was 2029 or 2009 wasn't that important to him. He only hoped the mutant children's escape would proceed as planned, giving him a chance to escape the lab. According to the plot of Logan, it shouldn't be long before a kind nurse helps the mutant children escape the lab. To maintain his image as an obedient and easily controlled person, George, as usual, didn't talk to anyone, quietly went back to his room after dinner, and closed his eyes to sleep. The entire lab was under surveillance, and he had to hide any emotion to avoid arousing suspicion and lower the staff's guard. To further reduce their wariness, he even deliberately concealed some of his abilities during training, such as the speed of his dagger attacks and some thoughts about his own capabilities. Of course, he couldn't appear too weak, or he might be treated like trash. What's wrong? It hurts. Half asleep, George suddenly felt a pain as if his soul was being torn apart, but this pain came and went quickly, not tormenting him for long. However, after the pain subsided, he found himself in a very strange state. He abruptly opened his eyes, and two completely different perspectives appeared before him. One was the view he could normally see from his lab bedroom, and the other was from a very dilapidated cubicle. At the same time, he felt as if he suddenly had another body, and that body could be controlled as freely as his current one. How to describe it? It was as if he had suddenly gained a controllable clone. The original body closed its eyes and lay back down on the bed, focusing its attention on the clone. Suddenly, fragments of memories flashed through his mind like a movie. After they ended, he murmured, "This is the wizarding world of Harry Potter." In his memories, the 11-year-old child was named Dora. Originally an orphan from an orphanage. She was adopted by a wizard from Nocturne Alley due to the unusual manifestations of her wizarding bloodline. But this wizard was no good. He was a hidden dark wizard. His purpose in adopting Dora was simply to conduct dark magic and potion experiments, plus an extra free laborer. After all, using muggles for experiments would easily attract the attention of the Ministry of Magic, but using his adopted son was different. As long as he didn't say anything, no one would find out, and even if she accidentally died one day, it could be said to be an accident. Moreover, many dark spells and potions had different effects on muggles and wizards, and experiments with wizards were more effective. And so, poor Dora grew up under the torment of the dark wizard. Because of the prolonged torment, Dora's personality became extremely timid. He dared not defy the dark wizard, nor dared he tell anyone about his situation, living a miserable life even worse than that of a house elf. Dora had originally hoped that Hogwarts would accept him at the age of 11, thus escaping the dark wizard's clutches. Unfortunately, although he did receive an acceptance letter, the dark wizard did not intend for him to attend Hogwarts. For young wizards born into Muggle families, once they reached 11, regardless of their parents' consent, they would definitely be admitted to Hogwarts. This is because if a young wizard did not learn magic and did not know how to channel magical power, they might develop fear and aversion towards their unknown abilities, and in extreme emotional states, could very well become an obscurus, which is absolutely forbidden in the wizarding world. However, for children from wizarding families, there were not so many requirements. Wizarding parents could choose not only Hogwarts, but also other magic schools such as Volksbüttens, Durmstrang, and Ilvermorny. They could even send their children to magic training classes for the sake of saving money, or the wizarding parents could teach their children magic themselves. Upon learning from the dark wizard that she couldn't attend Hogwarts, Dora completely broke down and committed suicide by drinking a potion in her cubicle that night. For some reason, George's split soul took over Dora's body, becoming its new master. That's really tragic. George couldn't help but sigh after reading Dora's memories. Come here. Perhaps as a side effect of Dora's suicide attempt, George felt incredibly thirsty and instinctively activated his ability on the metal cup on the table. The cup quickly flew into his hand. He drank the water in one gulp, then suddenly froze. My ability. I can use it with this body too. Yes, he had just used the mutant's control over magnetism, but it wasn't his original body using it, it was his clone in this world using it. Could it be that the talents and abilities of two worlds can be shared? At this moment, a bold guess formed in George's mind. Turning his attention back to his original body, he indeed discovered something extra within Marvel's body. In Dora's memory, using the common knowledge of wizards, that was the unique magic inherent in a wizard's bloodline. If that's the case, then that's wonderful. At this moment, a series of plans were already unfolding in George's mind. Chapter 2: The Murder of the Black Wizard. The ability sharing meant that as long as his clone learned various magical spells in the Harry Potter world, his main body in the Marvel world could use them as well. Although he didn't have a wand in the Marvel world, it didn't matter. From what he understood, not everyone in the Harry Potter world used wands for spellcasting. High-level wizards could cast spells without a wand, and wizards in Africa still used traditional hand gestures. It's just that wands were faster and more effective, which is why most wizards chose to use them. Alternatively, he could learn to make wands himself later. The Marvel world had many things with special energy, so he might not be unable to find suitable materials for making wands. While the magic in the Harry Potter world wasn't very destructive, it was highly functional, and some spells even seemed to touch upon very high-level rules. For one thing, if he could learn apparition, he could at least escape most enemies in the Marvel world if he couldn't win. But before that, I need to think about how to reasonably kill the Dark Wizard. Killing someone, if it were George from his previous life, he really wouldn't dare. In his past life, he was just a corporate slave. He'd never even killed a chicken, let alone a human. When he went to the supermarket, he bought pre-processed, naked chickens. But in this life, after only 3 months, he'd already gotten used to it. In those 3 months, he'd killed 12 people in real combat. The lab didn't keep useless people. As a mutant being groomed as a future assassin, besides his normal ability training, he focused on learning how to kill. And the fastest way was through real combat. He had no choice. In real combat, if he didn't kill, he'd be killed. This was one of the reasons he desperately wanted to escape the lab. While he wasn't a saint, he had his own bottom line and disliked indiscriminate killing. He could have chosen to report the Dark Wizard. At this point, reporting him to the Ministry of Magic would likely be successful. He also lived in Nocturne Alley with the Dark Wizard, making it easy for him to come into contact with horrors. Dora didn't dare do this because she'd grown up under the torment of the Dark Wizard. The fear was ingrained in her bones, and she'd rather commit suicide than resist. However, this might have future consequences. That is, if the Aurors don't act in time, the Dark Wizard might have the chance to abscond with the money and could even retaliate. If he could kill the Dark Wizard discreetly, he could not only eliminate future threats but also inherit all of the Dark Wizard's wealth. Through Dora's memories, he knew the Dark Wizard had no family. With the Dark Wizard dead, he, as the adopted son, would be the sole heir. Moreover, he wasn't without confidence. First, the Dark Wizard was completely unprepared for him. In the Dark Wizard's eyes, Dora was a timid and cowardly child who didn't even have a wand and hadn't learned any spells. Second, he had experience using his abilities to manipulate blades to kill ordinary mercenaries in single combat. A wizard caught off guard and ambushed wouldn't react much faster than an ordinary person. At most, their special constitution would make them less likely to die. Finally, because he wasn't using magic and didn't have a wand, the chances of the Aurors discovering his actions afterward were slim. Of course, things were never ending, and failure wasn't out of the question. But fortune favors the bold. If this job succeeded, he would not only have a house in this world, but also a considerable fortune, enough for him to focus on studying and researching magic in the early stages. As far as he knew, Dark Wizards had made a lot of money selling various forbidden potions over the years. You slept in half an hour late today. Do you want me to use the transfiguration charm again to turn you into rat and hang you up to roast over a candle? Just as George was thinking, the door to the room was suddenly pulled open, and a bald old man in a black wizard's robe looked at George with eyes as cold as a snake. I'm sorry, Mr. Merton, I'll be right there. George imitated Dora's usual trembling and fearful manner, quickly getting up and dressing. The bald old wizard narrowed his eyes and said, Little Dora, don't worry. Although I helped you reject the Hogwarts acceptance letter, as long as you serve me well as before, I will teach you some powerful magic. No worse than going to Hogwarts. Powerful magic? Probably just cleaning and cooking magic, George muttered to himself, maintaining a submissive demeanor on the surface. Emerging from the cramped room, the sun was just rising. It was around 6:30 in the morning. Marvel is nighttime, here it's daytime. which is quite convenient. Controlling two bodies simultaneously still felt a bit strange. This way, one slept at night and the other acted during the day, allowing him to adjust. After leaving the cramped room down the hallway, following Dora's memories, he began preparing breakfast for the old wizard, cleaning the shop, and standing at the door to attract customers, as usual. The potion shop in Nocturne Alley didn't have many normal customers. Normal wizards wouldn't buy potions there. There were proper potion shops in Diagon Alley. Most of the people who come here to buy potions are dark wizards, or wizards who don't strictly abide by the Ministry of Magic's laws. The Ministry usually turns a blind eye to this. Almost every wizard knows what kind of stuff is in Nocturne Alley, so how could the Ministry not know? In George's view, this is perfectly normal. It's better to have Nocturne Alley than to let dark wizards do whatever they want in private. That way, if something goes wrong, there are clues to follow. Moreover, many high-ranking wizards in the wizarding world need Nocturne Alley to exist. Even the esteemed Lucius Malfoy occasionally sells his concocted illegal potions and magical items here for money. And so, until around 4 in the afternoon, George finally found a suitable opportunity to make his move. I'm going to concoct a madness potion. Close the shop temporarily, stand guard at the door, and don't let anyone disturb me, or I'll make you wish you were dead. The old wizard carefully took out precious magical herbs from several boxes, glaring fiercely at George. George immediately lowered his head and replied, trembling, yes, I certainly won't let anyone disturb you. The old wizard's words weren't a threat. Previously, Dora's negligence had allowed a guest to disturb the old wizard while he was concocting a potion, causing the potion to fail. The old wizard had tormented her with dark magic all night, and she almost didn't survive. However, this was also a perfect opportunity for George to kill the old wizard. From what he knew of Dora's memories, the madness potion was a high-level potion. Once ingested, it would completely disrupt a person's mind, turning them into a madman. Therefore, it was extremely valuable. However, concocting this potion was very difficult and dangerous. If not handled properly, it could easily explode, causing injury or even death to the wizard. In fact, concocting potions, especially high-level ones, was never a safe activity. Almost every year, wizards died in accidents while concocting potions. This was one of the reasons why high-level potions were so expensive in the wizarding world, and why skilled potion makers were so rare. Seeing the old wizard enter the dedicated potion-making hut in the backyard, George immediately closed the shop door and tiptoed to the window next to the hut to peek. He watched as the old wizard, in front of the potion-making vessel, took out herbs such as ariot, poison tentacles, lacewings, and the gallbladder of a two-headed snake, processing them one by one before placing them in the cauldron to brew. The old wizard hadn't instructed Dora in any magic, but to help him better serve customers, he had taught him a great deal about herbalism and potion making. Therefore, based on Dora's memories, George knew that the potion-making stage was the most prone to problems. This was because the wizard not only had to concentrate fully on casting the corresponding spells, but also constantly input magic to refine the potion. Explode. After enduring for a full hour, seeing the old wizard finally reach the potion-making stage, George immediately activated his ability, causing the candlestick on the table to accidentally collapse, overturning the cauldron in the process. The paste-like potion spilled onto the table, mixing with the remaining herbs. Oh no, the old wizard immediately stopped his concoction, cold sweat beading on his forehead. He tried to cast a spell to defend himself, but the moment he raised his wand, the paste-like potion exploded. The old wizard, struck head-on, was blasted away, first crashing heavily against the wall of the hut, then falling to the ground, spitting out several mouthfuls of blood. Wizards' bodies are indeed much stronger than ordinary people's. Seeing the 70 or 80-year-old wizard blasted like this, yet still alive, George couldn't help but sigh inwardly. If it were an ordinary person, even a young and strong man, taking such a hit would probably be fatal. This wasn't a simple explosion, it was the explosion of a failed potion concoction, mixed with magical backlash and a surge of magical power, not as simple as it seemed on the surface. Then I'll give you a really hard one. At this moment, veins bulged on George's forehead as he unleashed all his abilities on the chandelier above the hut. Having acquired wizarding blood, he discovered that his mutant abilities seemed to have improved significantly. Previously, he could only control 10 pounds of weight. Now, at full power, he could control at least 50 pounds. If he fully developed his abilities, he would undoubtedly surpass his original limit of 100 pounds. The chandelier, already teetering due to the explosion, plummeted from the roof under George's full control, piercing the old wizard's face before he could react. A scream rang out as the chandelier, propelled by George's power, pierced straight through the old wizard's eye and into his brain. With a normal wizard's physique, even if they were split in two, meaning missing an arm or leg, as long as they didn't die immediately, they could be revived with healing magic and potions, and the limbs could even be reattached. But if the brain were pierced like this, then apart from beings of Voldemort's caliber, few wizards could survive. Chapter 3 Inheritance. Looks like he's really dead. After waiting for about 5 minutes and seeing that the old wizard hadn't moved, George cautiously pushed open the door and went inside. He checked the old wizard's breathing and, confirming he was truly dead, breathed a sigh of relief. A 70 or 80-year-old dark wizard, he was no match for him in a direct fight. The old wizard protected his body with an ironclad charm, and then a simple stunning charm could easily bring him down. As a dark wizard, to live to such an old age, he must have some skills, and perhaps some powerful trump cards. The reason he was able to kill him in such a sneak attack wasn't mainly because of his superior abilities, but because the old wizard was completely unprepared. Confirming the old wizard's death, George feigned panic, quickly pushed open the closed shop door, and ran towards Diagon Alley. He didn't shout in Nocturne Alley, that might attract some malicious dark wizards before even attracting the Aurors. Something terrible has happened. Mr. Morton was injured in an explosion while concocting potions. Is there anyone who can help him? George ran to Diagon Alley and started shouting in a panic, looking like he'd really lost his father. Soon, 2 Aurors patrolling nearby were drawn to him. Take us there. Diagon Alley and Nocturne Alley, where wizards and dark wizards congregate, are patrolled by Aurors almost 24 hours a day to prevent any incidents from making the news and affecting the Ministry of Magic, especially the minister's reputation. Besides, it's the start of the school year, and many young wizards are being brought here by their parents for a big shopping spree. Director Scrimgeour, after testing, no magical fluctuations were found in the second wand, and no valuables were missing. Homicide is ruled out. It can be confirmed that the death was due to an accident caused by potion making. Inside Morton's potion shop, a female wizard with pink hair, a pale, heart-shaped face, and about 18 or 19 years old, was reporting the results of her investigation to a middle-aged wizard standing opposite George. The middle-aged wizard nodded in satisfaction after listening. Very detailed analysis, Tonks. It seems Mata has taught you well this past year. Follow his teachings closely, and in 2 years you can become a full-fledged Auror. Although Professor Moody has a bit of a temper, it's an honor to learn from him. A hint of smugness appeared on the witch's face. Although Alastair Moody had long since retired, he was a renowned Auror in the wizarding world. He had sent more than half of the dark wizards of Azkaban. To receive guidance from such a retired Auror during one's Auror preparation was something many of the other prospective Aurors envied. Meanwhile, George, who had been eavesdropping, noticed a glint in his eye after hearing their conversation. Scrimgeour, the head of the Auror office, is that Rufus Scrimgeour who later succeeded Cornelius Fudge as the new Minister of Magic? And Tonks, is that Nymphadora Tonks who disguised herself as Magus? He carefully recalled his memories of his past life, gradually forming some recollections of the two people before him. This Scrimgeour, after succeeding Cornelius Fudge as the new Minister of Magic, took a very hard line against Voldemort and the Death Eaters. Then he was brutally murdered by Voldemort. And this Tonks, she possessed the innate ability to freely change her appearance. And apparently even married Professor Lupin, only to find herself still a recent graduate without a formal position. It seemed Professor Lupin was indeed an older man with a younger woman. Of course, that wasn't important. What mattered was that he knew Scrimgeour and Tonks were both relatively responsible Aurors, which was a good thing for him now. Were all Aurors necessarily good people? Not necessarily. The Ministry of Magic was rife with corruption these days, with many Aurors involved. If he encountered a greedy Auror, it was hard to say how much of the inheritance he would ultimately inherit. What a pitiful child, finally adopted, and now an orphan. Handing the investigation report to the head of the department, Tonks turned to look at George, a look of sympathy in her eyes. Having just investigated, she naturally knew the background of this thin boy. That's not necessarily true. It might even be a good thing for him. However, Scrimgeour, hearing Tonks's sigh, shook his head. As the head of the Auror office, with so many years in the business, He knew all too well what kind of wizards were in Nocturne Alley. From the boy's thin, scarred body, he had already seen through the scheme and guessed most of it. That's why he said it was a good thing for the little boy, at least he could inherit a considerable fortune and go to Hogwarts. Child, your name is Dora, right? Because Mr. Merton died unexpectedly, you're his only family, so, Scrimgeour approached George and explained the situation. There were two main points. First, George could inherit the Dark Wizard's shop and the money he had saved at Gringotts. Second, with the Dark Wizard dead, no one would teach George magic, so he had to go to Hogwarts. Both points were within George's expectations, and he readily agreed. Throughout the investigation, he didn't appear too heartbroken. It would be too fake, and he didn't have the acting skills to fool the seasoned Scrimgeour. However, he did make a request at the end. Sir, I don't want to use the name Dora anymore. Could you change it? He wasn't familiar with the name Dora, and if possible, he'd prefer to go back to George. It sounded better. Of course. Miss Tonks will take you through all the inheritance procedures tomorrow. If you need it, we can also help you change your name. Scrimgeour wasn't too surprised by George's request. He figured George might be trying to forget some bad memories this way. Don't worry, leave it to me. Tonks stepped forward and gently patted George's head, rubbing it softly. She wasn't stupid. She'd already sensed something from the conversation between the director and George. Thank you very much, Miss Auror. George thanked her politely. Having the opportunity to connect with an Auror was certainly not a bad thing, especially since he might need her help in the future. Nocturne Alley is no good place. He inherited the Dark Wizard's legacy. It's like a child walking down the street with a piece of gold. It's bound to attract envy. He might not dare do anything openly, but what he might do behind the scenes is anyone's guess. What a sensible child. Seeing George so young yet so well behaved and polite, Tonks felt a surge of goodwill. Most adults don't dislike children that much. What they truly dislike are unruly children and their parents. If they encounter an obedient and polite child, many are willing to lend a hand. Chapter 4 Signs of a Prison Break. Today's actions were a bit risky, but now it seems it was all worth it. After Scrimgeour and Tonks, along with the other Aurors, finished dealing with the scene and left, George lay on the large bed in the Dark Wizard's comfortable bedroom and couldn't help but sigh. Leaving aside the life savings the old wizard Gringotts had accumulated over most of his life, this potion shop alone, along with all the potions and herbs inside, was a considerable fortune. Perhaps this was nothing compared to the truly wealthy wizards, but for a young wizard, it was more than enough. It's like an adult having $1 million in assets. It might not be something to brag about, but if a middle school student had $1 million in pocket money, it would absolutely put most students in the country to shame. With this large sum of money, many things would be much easier. He had actually considered selling the potion shop after inheriting the fortune for safety and moving into the Leaky Cauldron. But then he thought better of it. Because in the future, he would definitely need such a private place to research magic that couldn't be discovered. Moreover, this potion shop might have many uses in the future. Selling it is easy, but buying it back would be difficult. This child looks really thin. He needs to eat more to nourish himself. Sitting up, George walked around the bedroom, then went to the mirror and carefully examined his body in this world. Since waking up, he had been preoccupied with planning how to kill the old wizard in a reasonable way, and hadn't had a chance to properly look at this body. Golden hair, blue eyes, a high nose bridge. His features were quite good, but due to long-term malnutrition and suffering, his body was rather thin. However, this wasn't a major problem. With proper care, he could recover. Luckily, my inner strength isn't that weak. George bent his knees and jumped, easily leaping over 3 meters high, reaching the ceiling. This wasn't because he was a wizard, which gave him such powerful jumping ability. Wizards' bodies were indeed extraordinary, possessing superior resilience and regenerative abilities. But in terms of strength, unless they had a special bloodline like Hagrid, they were no different from ordinary muggles. George is so special because his body not only possesses the mutant abilities of those in the Marvel Universe, but also inherited their physical strength. In other words, his current strength is the sum of the strength of 11-year-old Dora's body plus that of 18-year-old cyborg mutant 757. While mutant 757's abilities don't enhance his physique like Beast or Wolverine, he still has the body of a normal 18-year-old adult. Furthermore, in the past 3 months, he's not only undergone ability training in the Marvel Universe, but also physical conditioning and close combat training, making his physical attributes significantly stronger than a normal 18-year-old. To put it roughly, if Dora's punch strength is 50 pounds and 757's is 200 pounds, then both Dora and 757 now have a strength of around 250 pounds. Of course, this is just a rough estimate, precise measurements are needed. For 757, an extra 50 pounds isn't significant, but for Dora, an extra 200 pounds is a huge difference. Especially since Dora's body is currently very light, weighing only 50 pounds, the sudden addition of body 757 made her abilities even more pronounced. She could leap 3 meters with a single bound. Her agility was comparable to that of a feline. I'm considered a super kid among kids. After a brief examination of the body, George began a thorough search of the old wizard's bedroom. He wanted to see if he could find any hidden forbidden dark magic books or notes on dark magic research, so he could learn some powerful dark magic in advance. However, the result disappointed him. He didn't find any special magic books, just normal magic books that could be bought in bookstores. Actually, thinking about it, it makes sense. The shops in Nocturne Alley are routinely inspected every month, and even if there were, the old wizard wouldn't dare to openly hide them in his house. Never mind, let this body rest first. It's been a long day. Having found nothing useful, George quickly washed up and lay down on the old wizard's luxurious bed, putting the body into sleep mode. At the same time, he focused his main attention back on his Marvel self. Here at Marvel, it was already daytime, and it was time for daily training. It should be soon. Looks like I need to hurry and learn a few useful spells. After morning training, George ate his lunch expressionlessly, but his eyes were constantly glancing at the mutant children gathered together. Just now, as he passed through the corridor, he saw a nurse being berated by the supervisor. Apparently, the nurse had prepared a cake to celebrate the birthdays of the mutant children who had never had one before. If he remembered correctly, shortly after that, the nurse had a change of heart and led the mutant children in a mass escape. Training continued as usual in the afternoon, and after his main body fell asleep that night, his mind returned to the Harry Potter world. It was morning here. He got up, tidied himself up, made himself a hearty breakfast, and took out the Daily Prophet delivered by Al to his door. George ate his breakfast while reading the newspaper the old wizard had subscribed to. The food at the experimental base was nutritious, but the taste, well, it just didn't suit his palate. Back when the Dark Wizard was still alive, Dora struggled to even get a full meal, let alone enjoy any taste. Internationally renowned figure and author, recipient of the Order of Merlin, 3rd class, honorary member of the League Against the Dark Arts, and 5-time winner of the Wizarding Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award, Mr. Gilderoy Lockhart, will be signing copies of his autobiography, My Magical Self, at Flourish and Blots on August 21st from 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. Looking at the flamboyant wizard in his forget-me-not blue robes on the Daily Prophet's page, George couldn't help but sigh. If only I had come a year earlier, I could have been in the same class as the trio, maybe even in the same house and dormitory. Indeed, it wasn't 1991, but 1992, Harry Potter's second year at Hogwarts. He would be starting a year later than Harry Potter. Being with the trio, well, there were advantages and disadvantages. The disadvantage was that he was easily drawn into many situations, affecting his magical studies. The advantage is that he is aware of these events, and as long as they are handled properly, there will be no real danger in the end. He can also gain some additional benefits from them. Chapter 5: The Magnificent Ministry of Magic. So what if I'm a year younger? The most important thing is learning magic. George put down his newspaper and ate while thinking. He had actually considered which house he might be sorted into at the sorting ceremony. He figured it was most likely Gryffindor. Gryffindor values courage, and he considered himself quite courageous. He had only taken over this body yesterday and had already devised a plan to successfully kill an old wizard. Good morning, Dora. No, I should call you by your new name, George. The shop door opened, and a young, energetic witch strode in. It was Tonks, the aurora from yesterday. Good morning, Miss Tonks. George put down his pancake and greeted her with a smile. Tonks unceremoniously sat down opposite George and ruffled his hair. Don't be so formal. From now on, just treat me like your older sister. George reluctantly tidied his ruffled hair, not rejecting Tonks's closeness, and instead brought out a second breakfast he had prepared beforehand. I made an extra one this morning. Let's eat together. How did you know I didn't have breakfast? What's this? It tastes pretty good. Tonks tasted the rolled-up egg pancake on the plate, her eyes lighting up immediately. The soft pancake was filled with vegetables and sausage, a unique flavor. Her own cooking skills were terrible, so she never made breakfast. She usually just bought something to eat, or simply skipped breakfast and ate it with lunch. Although there are various cooking spells in magic, the prerequisite is that you have to know how to cook to use cooking spells to save time and quickly make delicious food. If you don't know how to cook, even if you use cooking spells, with ingredients and utensils flying everywhere, the final food will still be as bad as ever. This is the same principle as various housework spells. You can only use housework spells well if you know how to do housework. This is called an egg pancake. It's made with eggs and flour, and the filling is green pepper strips and carrot strips. George briefly introduced a breakfast he made. Of course, he didn't know if Twinks had eaten breakfast, but preparing it in advance would increase her favorability regardless of whether she ate it or not. I didn't expect you to be such a good cook. I bet you'll be sorted into Hufflepuff during the sorting ceremony. Although he didn't understand George's explanation, Tonks still gave him a thumbs up, which surprised George. I'm not really going to Hufflepuff, am I? He then shook his head. Hufflepuff wasn't really a problem, he personally preferred Gryffindor. But he felt that every house had its advantages and disadvantages. However, he still thought the chances of Hufflepuff were slim. Many Hufflepuff graduates went on to work in the food service industry, but the hallmark of that industry wasn't cooking skills, but rather integrity, loyalty, honesty, and perseverance. Choosing the food service industry was probably because their dormitories were close to the kitchen, and they were exposed to it from a young age. And of these qualities, except for the last one, he didn't seem to possess much. After breakfast, led by Tonks, George began processing the various inheritance procedures. And the first place they were going was the renowned Ministry of Magic. Hold on tight to my arm, it might hurt a little for a moment, but bear with it, it'll pass quickly. Tonks placed George's hand on her arm, carefully instructing him before beginning to chant the spell. Apparition, a soft popping sound rang out, and Twinks and George instantly vanished from their spot. Nocturnally wasn't far from the Ministry of Magic, so she could apparate directly with George, without wasting flu powder. No wonder not all wizards like to use apparition to travel. George felt himself instantly plunged into darkness, followed by a feeling of air being compressed from all directions, making it almost impossible for him to breathe. It felt as if several iron clamps were tightly constricting his chest, his eyeballs were being forced back into his head, and his eardrums were being pressed deep into his skull. In short, it was extremely awkward and uncomfortable. However, it was very short-lived, lasting only a second or two, before he saw the light again. It'll be a little uncomfortable the first time, but you'll get used to it. At that moment, Tonks's giggles reached his ears. Come on, I'll take you to register first. And so, George was led towards the reception area in the center of the hall, looking around curiously. It's really quite magnificent. After a moment, he couldn't help but exclaim. The floor was made of gleaming dark wood, and the peacock blue ceiling was inlaid with shimmering gold symbols that constantly moved and changed, like a giant high-altitude bulletin board. Many gilded fireplaces were embedded in the walls on both sides, with wizards in various costumes going in and out of them. In the very center of the hall was a magical fountain with 5 statues, a dashing wizard holding a wand, a beautiful witch, and centaurs, goblins, and house elves surrounding them. The centaurs, goblins, and house elves all looked at the wizard and witch with boundless adoration, as if it held some special meaning. Of course, that wasn't the main point. The main point was that these 5 statues, which looked 2 or 3 times larger than life-size, were actually made of pure gold. The Daily Prophet, gentlemen and ladies, a copy of the Daily Prophet, please. A wizard selling the Daily Prophet was standing by the fountain. At noon, after a full 4 hours, George finally completed all the inheritance procedures and was paraded back to the shop by Tonks. All bark and no bite. No wonder Voldemort dismantled it so easily. This was George's rant about the Ministry of Magic. The entire Ministry of Magic looked incredibly opulent, but in reality, the wizards working there were extremely lazy, inefficient, and corrupt. If it weren't for Tonks, he felt that inheriting the entire estate would have been quite difficult. However, it wasn't all without its merits. At least he saw many interesting things at the Ministry of Magic. Various magical items imbued with magical abilities through alchemy, and all sorts of interesting little spells developed for easier office work, etc. He broadened his horizons considerably. This also made him realize that while magic in the Harry Potter world rarely has widespread destructive power and is mostly functional magic, it doesn't necessarily mean it's weak. In fact, in some aspects, it can be even more dangerous and terrifying. This is because much magic is subjective and cannot be judged solely by its external destructive force. Chapter 6 Gringotts Deposits. The final step, I'll take you to Gringotts. Without lingering in the shop, Tonks led George to Gringotts. Gringotts is the only wizarding bank in the British magical world, run by goblins, located on the north side of Diagon Alley. Besides storing money and safekeeping the valuables of wizards and witches, it also allows the exchange of Muggle currency for magical currency. George has now officially inherited the old wizard's legacy through the Ministry of Magic, so naturally he wants to go to Gringotts to make all the money the old wizard had deposited his own. So ugly. Arriving at the entrance of Gringotts, looking at the goblin guards in their scarlet and gold uniforms, George muttered to himself. The goblins and elves of this world weren't the beautiful creatures he had imagined. On the contrary, they were quite ugly, roughly resembling goblins. Following Twinks up the white steps and through Gringotts' bronze doors, a second silver door appeared before him, inscribed with very conspicuous text. The gist of it was, "Don't covet Gringotts' wealth, or you'll suffer a terrible fate." Two goblin waiters stood beside the silver doors. Upon seeing Twinks and George, they bowed and led them into a grand marble hall. About 100 goblins were bustling about, processing various transactions for the wizards. Tonks led George to an idle goblin and presented him with the various documents they had just obtained from the Ministry of Magic. Change of ownership of the underground vault. Unlike the Ministry of Magic staff, Gringotts goblins were extremely efficient. They quickly checked all the documents, and after confirming their accuracy, said to George, "This is the key to vault number 352. Please keep it safe." "Do you need to go to the vault to withdraw money now?" "No, just tell me how many galleons are left in the vault." George took the key and put it in his pocket. The shop still had 500 galleons left by the old wizard after his death, enough for his current needs. Vault number 352 currently has a total of 13,200 galleons remaining, the goblin replied after reviewing the accounts. "Looks like running a potion business is really lucrative. I only get 100 galleons a month now, and even after I become a full-time employee, it'll only be 140 galleons. Tonks couldn't help but show an envious look. At her salary, it would probably take her 10 years to accumulate that many galleons, and that's without spending any money. Otherwise, it might take 20 or 30 years to save that much. George, who had been frowning, instantly calmed down after hearing Tonks' words. He had initially thought the old wizard had at least 100,000 galleons in savings, so he was somewhat disappointed to hear she only had a little over 10,000. But thinking about it, it made sense. The old wizard running a potion shop and doing black market business must be very profitable, probably more than a legitimate potion shop. But buying the shop must have cost a fortune, and researching potions, especially high-level ones, was incredibly expensive. Having only 10,000 galleons left was reasonable. Compared to Twink's salary, 10,000 galleons was a lot, enough to squander for a long time. Wizarding currency comes in three forms: galleons, sickles, and knuckles. 1 galleon equals 17 sickles, and 1 sickle equals 29 knuckles. According to Dora's memory, a copy of the Daily Prophet only costs 5 knuckles. A normal meal costs about 2 or 3 sickles, and a wizard's wand usually costs no more than 10 galleons. George, Hogwarts should resend your acceptance letter tomorrow morning. Study hard at Hogwarts, you'll definitely make many friends there. I'm off now, I'll come see you sometime. At the Gringotts entrance, Tonks smiled and ruffled George's hair again. George's heart skipped a beat, and he sincerely invited her. "Sister Tonks, without you, I definitely wouldn't have been able to inherit the estate so smoothly. I'd like to treat you to lunch to express my gratitude. You won't refuse, will you?" Tonks wanted to say she had to return to the Ministry of Magic, but looking at George's sincere and expectant eyes, and recalling the delicious food she had that morning, she hesitated. "Of course I won't refuse, then I'll trouble you. It's already this late, time to eat something, and it won't be a big deal to be back from the Ministry of Magic a little later." Seeing Tonks agree, George breathed a slight sigh of relief. He needed Tonks to appear in his shop as often as possible to dispel the dark wizard schemes in Nocturne Alley. At the same time, he wanted to cultivate a good relationship with Tonks. If Tonks could come to the shop more often, He would have the opportunity to learn a few more spells from Twinks before going to Hogwarts. This was crucial for his main body. Escaping the experimental base wasn't easy, and withstanding the subsequent pursuit was even harder. Every spell he learned would provide more protection, especially since he knew that his main body's chance to escape the experimental base wouldn't be long. Luckily, my cooking skills are pretty good. George planned to prepare a feast to see if he could use the food to encourage Tonks to come more often. Dora, as the old wizard's slave, had developed considerable culinary skills through years of training, and George himself had a fondness for food in his previous life. While not comparable to professional chefs, his cooking skills were unanimously recognized by his friends. Of course, Eastern and Western tastes differ, but that didn't matter. He could cook some of the most popular Eastern dishes in Britain, which minimized the margin for error. Besides, Britain itself didn't have much culinary delight. As the saying goes, the thinnest books in the world are British cookbooks and American history books, or something like that. What's this dish? It tastes very unique. I've never had it anywhere else before. Sweet and sour pork, and this? It's delicious too. Kung Pao chicken, and this? Scrambled eggs with tomatoes. After lunch, Tonks sat in her chair, patting her round belly, and exclaimed, "I didn't expect you could cook Chinese food. If you like it, Sister Tonks, you can come over often. I can cook many more delicious dishes," George said with a smile as he cleared the dishes. Tonks waved her hand dismissively. "How could I? I'm not that shameless." In her eyes, George was already pitiful enough. How could she possibly take advantage of her aura status? That wasn't her style. Seeing Tonks' refusal, George guessed the reason and said earnestly, "Sister Tonks, don't be embarrassed. Your frequent visits for meals are actually very helpful to me. This is Nocturne Alley." At this point, there was no need to beat around the bush. Tonks wasn't stupid. After George's reminder, she immediately understood. "In that case, okay. Then I'll come over for meals whenever I have time. But I won't freeload, I'll buy all the groceries." You can't refuse. Chapter 7: The Big Shopping Spree in Diagon Alley. That night, George's consciousness returned to his Marvel self. Another day of grueling training. Nothing particularly noteworthy had occurred. However, his intuition told him that an escape might be imminent. He noticed the mutant children had a comic book in their hands, titled Extraordinary X-Men. To be honest, he still hadn't figured out the history of this universe. The existence of the X-Men and X-Men-related comics suggested that mutants had once been quite famous. So why the Super Soldier program, and why Captain America? He'd have to escape the experimental facility and research the history to understand. In the Harry Potter world, early morning. George was retrieving the Daily Prophet from the mailbox at the shop's entrance when he found an extra letter. Finally, the pale yellow envelope was addressed in emerald green ink to Mr. George, Merton Potion Shop, Nocturne Alley. Indeed, it was a reissued Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry acceptance letter. Although he knew Scrimgeour and Twinks had both said it, it couldn't be wrong. His heart was still racing when he actually received the acceptance letter. That was Hogwarts, a real magic school, and he would soon be going there to learn all sorts of amazing magic. Magic. Who could resist the magic of magic? Let's get started with a big shopping. After quickly finishing breakfast, George, holding the list of books and equipment included in the envelope, walked confidently out of Merton's potion shop. But his good mood was immediately ruined by an eyesore. "Isn't this little Dora? I heard you got accepted back into Hogwarts. Are you going to buy school supplies?" A hunched-over, slick-haired old wizard stood at the entrance of the opposite shop, greeting George with a sinister look. "Good morning, Mr. Borgin. I'm just going to buy some spell books for school. Also, I've changed my name to George now." George felt annoyed, but still replied politely. This old wizard was no ordinary person. He was arguably the most senior dark wizard in Nocturne Alley. His Borgin and Burke Antique shop was the largest magical shop in Nocturne Alley. Its business was extremely broad, selling and buying back items imbued with dark magic or other dangerous items, and providing secret appraisals for rare and ancient magical artifacts. Voldemort, in his youth, had worked for this ruthless antique shop, and it was through the shop's complex connections that he found and crafted two Horcruxes. The old wizard Borgin was currently George's biggest worry. If Borgin gave up on targeting him, then no dark wizard in Nocturne Alley would dare to covet the potion shop he had inherited. "What a good boy. I think that Aurora lady had lunch at your house yesterday." Borgin smiled, though a somewhat chilling smile. George smiled back, but his smile was much brighter. Yes, Sister Tonks really likes my cooking. She said she'll bring her colleagues and Uncle Scrimgeour over for a meal next time. That'll be a lot of trouble for you. Bargain narrowed his eyes slightly. George shook his head, looking innocent. No trouble at all. I love cooking. How about I cook more next time they come, Mr. Borgin, and you can try my cooking? No need. Borgin's face stiffened, then he turned and went back into his dark shop. After Borgin left, George muttered to himself, dare to mess with me? I'll take your shop sooner or later and kill you, you old bastard. Composing himself, he set off again into Diagon Alley. Compared to the narrow and dark Nocturne Alley, Diagon Alley was much brighter, full of normal wizards with children shopping and shopkeepers hawking their wares. Dragon liver, 16 sieverts an ounce, cruces, copper, brass, pewter, silver crucibles, all sizes available, automatic stirring and foldable, grey-wood owl, howling owl, grass owl, brown owl, snow owl. We have the pets you want. Nimble 2001, the fastest flying broomstick, you deserve it. Strolling through the bustling Diagon Alley, George didn't hesitate to spend money, buying mostly the best tools. Although a poor student might have many tools, he felt that better tools were more efficient, and since he had the money, why be stingy? A complete uniform, crucible, binoculars, medicine bottles, scales, wands, just missing books, oh, and a pet. 2 hours later, George pushed a cart full of various school supplies, calculating the items still on his list. Actually, buying other things didn't take much time, even buying wands was quick. He tried a few, found the one that suited him best, and bought it. The main time was spent taking measurements while buying the uniform. Era owl shop, perfect, I'll buy an owl then. Seeing the owl shop on the street, George thought for a moment, then pushed his cart inside. There were many pets a young wizard could choose from, but he felt that an owl was the most useful, because wizarding owls were different from ordinary owls. Wizarding magical owls, besides being smarter, also possessed location magic, able to find the recipient no matter where they were, unless the recipient used a shielding spell. Besides delivering letters, they could deliver all sorts of things, and their strength far exceeded that of a normal owl. They could easily handle weights of 10 or 20 pounds. He was a pragmatist. If he was going to buy a pet, he naturally wanted something useful, otherwise it was better not to buy one at all. He didn't have the energy to keep a pet. Welcome to Era Owl Shop, sir. What kind of owl would you like? Seeing George enter, a shop assistant quickly came forward. That one. Scanning the entire shop, he quickly found the owl he wanted. Following George's finger, the shop assistant's eyes widened in surprise. Are you sure you want that one? Yes, George nodded firmly. The shop assistant hesitated for a moment before explaining. I should also remind you that it's 10 times more expensive than a normal owl, costing 100 galleons. The owl George was pointing to wasn't an ordinary-sized owl, but a large eagle owl that was nearly a meter tall when standing. Normally, only adult wizards with special hobbies or for research would spend money to buy such a large owl. He had never seen any young wizard buy one as a pet. Firstly, it was too expensive, and secondly, even if they had the money, their parents wouldn't feel safe with such a large owl. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 8 Magic isn't easy. Is this enough? George didn't mind, taking out a bulging cloth bag and placing it on the table with a smile. He chose such a large owl for two main reasons. First, this size owl already possessed considerable attack capabilities, which could provide him with significant assistance in case of danger. Second, he valued its flying ability. A normal magical owl could carry over 10 kilograms, so this large owl could easily carry over 100 kilograms. If he encountered trouble he couldn't overcome, he could have the owl carry him away. It wasn't just a pet, it could also be a flying mount. Who else would he choose? Since you're sure, then of course there's no problem. The shop assistant estimated there were at least 400 gold coins in the bag. He was genuinely wealthy and not joking, and immediately and enthusiastically helped George carry the owl onto the cart, afraid George might change his mind. This owl ate quite a lot every day. If no wizard bought it, they'd lose money. With a pet purchased, George went to the last and most important shop, Flourish and Blot's bookstore. Today, he wasn't just buying all the first-grade textbooks, he also wanted to buy many other spellbooks, especially those about hand gestures. Because if he couldn't learn hand gestures, his Marvel Universe self wouldn't be able to use his magical abilities properly until he crafted a wand. Today was August 3rd, 18 days before Gilderoy Lockhart's book signing at Flourish and Blotts, so the bookstore wasn't too crowded, making finding a book relatively easy. He could simply ask the clerk. Hand gestures? Those books aren't sold anymore. Everyone uses ones now. Who would learn such outdated spellcasting methods? The clerk shook his head. George didn't give up, continuing, I'm very interested in those outdated spellcasting methods. Could you help me find a copy? I can pay extra. To show his sincerity, he first took out 20 galleons. The clerk hesitated for a moment, then held up 4 fingers. It needs to be ordered separately. The cost is high. 40 galleons, no problem. George immediately took out 40 galleons and placed them on the table. He knew he was being ripped off at this price, but if he could get the spellbooks related to hand gestures, he'd pay 40, even 400. 3 days, definitely within 3 days. The shopkeeper, seeing this, immediately smiled and accepted 40 galleons. I'll come back to pick it up in 3 days. After browsing around again, and paying the clearly marked price in galleons, George pushed his fully loaded cart, humming an unknown tune, and began his return to the apothecary in Nocturne Alley, preparing to study magic on his own. On the way back, his large, conspicuous eagle owl attracted many curious glances. Be good, don't bark. Back at the shop, he placed the eagle owl on the bedroom table, fed one of the rabbits he bought from the owl shop, gave a few instructions, and then began organizing the spellbooks he just bought. The eagle owl, upon hearing George's words, nodded very obediently. For ordinary aspiring wizards, eagle owls were too large to handle and dangerous, unsuitable as pets. But for George, it was different. His body was stronger than that of a normal adult, and the eagle owl, though large, posed no challenge to him. As for danger, the psychic abilities he inherited from Professor X were only at level 2. Having little effect on complex humans but proving quite effective on simple animals. He could not only communicate easily with animals but also influence their behavior to some extent. Sometimes George thought that if he devoted time to studying magical creatures, he might not be inferior to Newt and Hagrid in the future and could also become a master of magical creatures. Standard spells, beginner and magical theory, he thought, pulling out the 2 most important books from a pile of spellbooks and beginning to study them intently. Right now, the most important thing was to master practical spells. As for other subjects such as magical history, herbs, and potions, they could be put aside for now until the crisis of the Marvel Universe was over. He studied until evening. Sure enough, it's not that simple. Putting down the spellbooks, rubbing his dry eyes, George picked up a piece of bread he had bought while shopping in Diagon Alley and started eating. Watching movies, it seems like wizards can cast spells simply by waving their wands. It looks so easy. But actually learning how to do it reveals that successfully casting a spell is far from simple. It's like cooking. It looks like just a few steps, but when it comes to actually doing it yourself, you're completely lost. Even if the steps are the same, the taste will be completely different. According to spellbooks, to successfully cast a spell, you first need wizarding blood and magical power. Otherwise, even if all the subsequent steps are correct, it's still useless. Secondly, there's the incantation itself. The spell must be pronounced clearly, and different spells have different speeds and emotions. If you don't meet the standards, the magical effect will be greatly weakened, or it won't work at all. There are also rare cases where it might produce unexpected effects. Finally, there's the action of waving the wand. Waving the wand isn't random, the trajectory differs depending on the spell. Of course, these are all for beginners. If you truly understand and master a spell, and even have a deep understanding of its fundamental principles, casting that spell without a wand or sound is not difficult. Truly top-tier wizards can cast most spells instantly without a wand or a sound. Softening Charm, Cutting Charm, Lockpicking Charm, Levitating Charm, Locking Charm, and Repairing Charm. Focus on learning the Lockpicking Charm first. After finishing his bread, George flipped to the page on Lockpicking Charms and Standard Spells, Beginner. The spells in first-year textbooks are the most basic and easiest to learn, but also practically powerless. Like the Cutting Charm, even if he learned it, at his level, he could only cut a napkin. It probably wouldn't even break a person's skin. So, he'd rather learn the Lockpicking Charm first. That way, his Marvel counterpart could unlock the mutant ability suppressor around his neck, unleashing his powers. He could also open the high-tech doors of the research lab and escape. If he had extra time, he could learn other spells later. Actually, he thought the transfiguration charm would be more useful than the lockpicking charm, especially against high-tech weapons. Destroying even one component could disable it. But after careful consideration, he decided against it. Transfiguration charms are treated as a separate category, making them significantly more difficult to learn than other spells. Even a genius like Hermione couldn't master them before the start of the school year, so he didn't believe he could learn them quickly without guidance. Even if he did, the effects probably wouldn't be as noticeable, so there was no need to take the risk. Chapter 9 Hello, Harry. 3 days later, George successfully obtained a copy of the hand gesture spellcasting guide from a clerk at Flourish and Blots. 10 days later, George stood in the yard, waving his wand at a locked box and chanting, Alahomora. A blue beam of magic shot from the tip of his wand, striking the box precisely. Most spells, especially offensive and targeted spells like the lockpicking charm, disarming charm, and killing curse, are accompanied by beams of different colors when cast. However, some spells are cast silently, without any obvious signs, such as the summoning charm, healing charm, and levitation charm. Click, a crisp sound rang out from the lock, and the latch automatically popped open. Finally succeeded, George smiled with satisfaction. After 10 days of tireless research, plus the occasional help from twinks who came over for meals, he could finally cast the lockpicking charm successfully. And through these days of learning, he also realized that he wasn't some so-called magical genius. True geniuses are like Hermione, who, without any prior experience or guidance, spent most of their time learning about magical history and common knowledge while occasionally studying spells, yet easily mastered several spells before school even started. Even more prodigies are like Snape, who could create powerful spells during his school years. As for Dumbledore, Grindelwald, and Voldemort, they can't be described as geniuses. Fortunately, he had his own methods. Although he said he studied for 10 days, he actually studied for 20. Because when his body couldn't take it anymore and needed rest, his main body in the Marvel Universe took over. The most important thing in learning magic is talent, followed by diligence. He lacked talent, so he made up for it with diligence. His main body was at the experimental base, with nothing else to do besides training, giving him plenty of free time. He could easily find a stick similar to a wand and practice his feel for it. Through constant practice and reflection, he could accelerate his learning of spells. As long as he avoided being detected or turned away from surveillance cameras, it wouldn't matter. After all, no one in this world knew what he was doing. Once his main body is free, his learning speed will be even faster, as he will essentially have twice the time others have to study and research magic. In fact, if it's not considered cheating, learning a spell in 10 days is considered genius among wizards. Most junior wizards don't master many spells in a year, some only a few. Next, I just need to practice hand gestures until I can successfully cast the spell, then I can consider the next one. After several experiments to confirm he had fully mastered the unlocking spell, George immediately discarded his wand and began practicing according to the hand gesture casting guide. 8 days later, through continuous practice with both his main body and his clone, he could finally cast the unlocking spell without a wand. However, compared to casting the unlocking spell with a wand in 1 or 2 seconds, casting with hand gestures takes about 7 or 8 seconds, and even with practice, it's estimated to take 5 or 6 seconds. In a duel between two wizards, 5 or 6 seconds is enough time for the opponent to cast 3 or 4 attack spells with their wand. No wonder this method of casting spells was phased out. August 21st. Today is Lockhart's book signing day at Flourish and Blots. George ate breakfast while glancing at the date on his magical calendar, slowly calculating in his mind. He had no interest in that big liar Lockhart, but if he remembered correctly, today was also the day Harry Potter came to Diagon Alley with the Wheel Eyes to buy school supplies. After finishing his first year, Harry returned to his aunt and uncle's house during the summer vacation because of Dobby the house elf, which his uncle had locked up, forbidding him from attending Hogwarts. It was his good friends Ron and the Weasley brothers who secretly drove their father's magical car and brought him back to the burrow. I'll try to make contact first. In the end, he decided it was worth taking the initiative. Compared to Voldemort, who wouldn't be resurrected for several years, he felt that being with Harry and the others would be more beneficial now. Many places and things at Hogwarts were practically inaccessible to him if he wanted to, but with Harry and the others, there were no such problems. For example, the forbidden areas in the Hogwarts library, with its spellbooks, would be virtually impossible for him to sneak a peek into. But if you were with Harry, Dumbledore would turn a blind eye, as would the Room of Requirement. So, after breakfast, George didn't continue studying spells as usual, but instead stood at the window of the apothecary's lobby, observing the outside world. About an hour later, he saw a father and son with blonde hair walk gracefully into Borgin's blog across the street. That must be the Malfoys. It seems Harry Potter is already in the shop, bringing a child into Nocturne Alley at this time, coupled with their expensive wizard robes and air of authority, made it easy to identify them. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, shortly after the father and son left Borgin's blog, a thin, bespectacled boy covered in dust rushed out of the shop. Where am I? Harry stood in the narrow, dark alley, feeling a chill run down his spine as he looked around at the shops that seemed to be filled with dark magic. In the window of the shop next door, some shrunken human heads were displayed eerily, and 2 shops away, a large cage was swarming with enormous black spiders. Turning his head to the right, he saw 2 ragged wizards whispering and watching him from a dark doorway. I need to get out of here quickly, hopefully I can find my way out. Today was the first time he had used Floo powder, and for some reason, something had gone wrong. Instead of reaching Diagon Alley, he had ended up in a creepy, strange shop, and had even inadvertently witnessed a Malfoy's illegal business. Are you lost? Just as he was nervously preparing to slip away from the dark doorway and grope his way in another direction, a steady yet slightly childish voice suddenly sounded behind him. Turning around, he saw a boy, just as thin as himself, but with a very resolute face, standing behind him holding a spellbook. This is Nocturne Alley, a place teeming with dark wizards. It's not safe for you to be here alone. Hello, my name is Harry. I accidentally came here because of Floo powder. I want to go to Diagon Alley. Perhaps sensing the boy's kindness, Harry quickly explained. George smiled upon hearing this. Hello, Harry, my name is George. You must have mispronounced Diagon Alley as Nocturne Alley. But it's alright, they're connected. I'll take you out. Chapter 10 Hermione and Hagrid. George, thank you for getting me out. Emerging from the eerie Nocturne Alley into the bustling Diagon Alley, Harry finally breathed a sigh of relief and immediately thanked George. He felt that if George hadn't escorted him, those strange and eerie wizards along the way might have eaten him alive. Harry. Just then, a little girl with thick, fluffy brown hair came running down the street. It's so good to see you. You're covered in dust, and your glasses are ruined too. It's good to see you too, Hermione. Harry adjusted his cracked glasses, a happy smile spreading across his face. It was an accident. Alright, let me fix it for you. Restore it to its original state. Hermione drew her wand and cast a restoration spell on Harry's glasses. As if time had reversed, the cracked glasses were restored to brand new condition in just a few seconds. Looks like I need to practice this spell a bit more. Harry looked at his now new glasses and couldn't help but sigh. He wasn't Hermione. He hadn't just learned all the spells in the first-year textbook, he'd also taught himself many. He hadn't even fully mastered the basic spells, including the repair charm. Like Harry, George shared the same thought. The repair charm wasn't just for affixing small things like glasses. With practice, it could easily repair collapsed buildings. In the Marvel Universe, he could make a fortune with this magic alone. Who are you? After fixing Harry's glasses, Hermione turned to George standing next to Harry, a look of confusion on her face. This is a friend I just met, George. This is Hermione Granger. Harry quickly introduced them. George extended his hand and smiled. Hello, beautiful Miss Granger. Hello, George. Hearing George compliment her beauty, Hermione's liking for him increased dramatically, and she happily shook his hand. Aside from her parents, this was the first time anyone had complimented her beauty. Many others had praised her intelligence, though. Harry, now that your friend is here, I should head back. Goodbye, Hogwarts. After shaking hands with Hermione, George didn't linger, waving and walking into Nocturne Alley. A first meeting was enough. There was no need to be overly familiar, as that would seem too deliberate. Besides, his time was precious. He needed to continue his studies in magic. Most importantly, he didn't intend to stop Malfoy from secretly giving Voldemort's diary to Ginny. Voldemort's diary contained Voldemort's soul, capable of bewitching minds. Even with his psychic abilities, He wasn't confident he could resist, so he didn't intend to obtain it. Trying to stop it was pointless. With Dumbledore around, it would only become a trial for Harry, and no young wizard would actually be harmed. He was also thinking of using this incident to see if he could gain some advantage. He seemed quite nice. "I've never seen him at school before," Hermione said, watching George's departing figure with a hint of doubt in her voice. George didn't look older than her, he was either in the same grade or a year ahead. She shouldn't have never seen him before. Harry chuckled, because he just started his first year at Hogwarts this year. "Of course you haven't seen him, so he's younger than us?" "How did you two meet?" Hermione asked curiously as she led Harry towards Flourish and Blotts. Harry then recounted his recent experience. Meanwhile, as George returned to his shop, he unexpectedly saw a very imposing figure standing at his door, peering around. Imposing didn't even begin to describe it, as his height far exceeded the limits of normal human height. A rough estimate put him at around 3.5 meters. Even if he reached out, he might not be able to touch the figure's waist. The figure exuded an overwhelming aura. "What's this guy doing at my shop?" Judging from his physique and attire, George immediately recognized him. It was none other than Rubeus Hagrid, the Hogwarts key-keeper, game field keeper, and master of magizoology, who possessed both wizard and giant blood. Thinking of Hagrid's background, he couldn't help but give Hagrid's father, Mr. Hagrid, a truly remarkable man. It's known that the normal height of giants is around 7 or 8 meters, and Mr. Hagrid, a male wizard of normal height, was able to mate with a female giant and reproduce. His astonishing talent was truly admirable. "Sir, is there anything I can help you with?" George asked, stepping forward. Hagrid turned and looked down at George, noticing a thin, small wizard, and immediately replied in a gentle tone, "I'm looking for a potion to repel flesh-eating slugs. I heard only this potion shop has it, but unfortunately, it seems to be closed." Although his voice was gentle, due to his enormous size, it sounded almost like a shout to George. "The owner of this potion shop, Mr. Merton, passed away recently in an accident while brewing potions. I'm currently managing it. I know the potion you're looking for, I can find it for you." George took out his key, opened the door, and quickly retrieved a bottle of potion from the counter. Although Dor couldn't brew potions, she was very knowledgeable about herbalism and the functions of all the potions in the shop because of her work introducing and attracting customers. The exorcism potion is very effective against cabbage caterpillars and heart-shaped worms, except for carnivorous slugs. "Oh, thank you, little boss." Hagrid took the potion with some surprise, a satisfied smile immediately spreading across his face. "How much?" "Cheerful, 14 silver shikotes." George smiled and held out his hand. "Much cheaper than I expected." Hagrid pulled a handful of silver shikotes from the pocket of his huge moleskin coat, counted out 14, and placed them in George's hand. He thought this rare potion would cost at least close to 2 galleons. "Because I'm going to Hogwarts soon, I'm in a good mood, so I gave you a half-price discount." George put the 14 silver shikotes into the box on the counter, deliberately saying happily. Since he could communicate with animals using his telepathic abilities and had the potential to become a master of magical creatures, he naturally couldn't waste it. Building a good relationship with Hagrid and learning more about magical creatures would be a good choice, whether for making money or raising magical creatures to increase one's strength. So, after recognizing Hagrid, he decided to befriend him. Hagrid was warm, kind, and straightforward, without much guile, so building a good relationship wouldn't be difficult. Sure enough, upon hearing his words, Hagrid visibly paused, his attitude instantly becoming much more friendly. He carefully examined George's face and smiled. "So you're a freshman this year. I'm Rubeus Hagrid, the gamekeeper at Hogwarts. Come find me when you have time after school starts, and I'll make you some rock cakes." Chapter 11 Counterattack, Escape from the Base. 5 days later, at the Mexico City Genetic Engineering Research Institute, Sander Rice looked at the young Wolverine X-24, cloned from Wolverine's genes, and couldn't help but laugh heartily. I finally succeeded. A Wolverine who completely obeys my commands. The future world will be at my feet." His father, Dale Rice, was one of the scientists who performed the adamantium transplant on Logan, and was killed when Logan escaped the lab. From that moment on, he was determined to kill all uncontrollable and dangerous mutants and create mutant soldiers who would completely obey his commands. Later, he founded Arclay Genetics, using the food and beverage companies he controlled to massively distribute the M43 virus they had developed to the public. This virus did not affect humans, but it would suppress the abilities of existing mutants and eliminate genetic mutations in human offspring. After more than 20 years of effort, the world would finally no longer see new mutants. Donald, since those test subjects are unwilling to obey orders, dispose of them all. Turning around, Dr. Rice coldly ordered a man whose right hand was entirely replaced by a mechanical arm. His original plan was to use the mutant genes he had collected earlier, through surrogate mothers in Mexico, to breed a new batch of mutant children, which he would then sell as weapons to other organizations. However, after this period of experimentation, he discovered that these children, once they grew up, had developed their own thoughts and could not be completely controlled. Some even attempted to escape. Therefore, now that he had developed mutant clones completely under his control, he naturally didn't need those failed experiments. Moreover, he felt that perhaps not only could they be sold as weapons, but if he could stably replicate large numbers of mutants who obeyed his commands, he could completely rule the world. Should we dispose of that 757 too? Donald wasn't surprised by Dr. Rice's suggestion. Dr. Rice hesitated for 2 seconds before nodding. Dispose of them. Now that the cloning technology is mature, besides mass-producing Wolverine, we might also be able to clone Professor X and Magneto. There's no need to waste resources on inferior experimental subjects. Understood? Donald drew his pistol from his waist, turned, and left the experimental base. Meanwhile, George, practicing hand gestures and spellcasting in his room, looked at the clock on the wall, his expression gradually becoming serious. Wait, is it about to begin? Normally, someone should have already come to take him to training at this time. Looks like it's starting. At this moment, his room door suddenly opened, and two familiar figures walked in. The one leading them was the instructor who had been training him all this time. I told you this guy was a piece of trash. All that training was a complete waste of my time. Now he's just going to be disposed of. The instructor glanced at George with disgust as he entered, then ordered a subordinate with a submachine gun, take care of him, then throw the body in the lab's incinerator. We'll burn it with that other trash later. Yes, Captain. The subordinate raised his submachine gun, aimed at George, and pulled the bolt. But just as he was about to pull the trigger, he heard Subject 757 suddenly utter a strange phrase. A lateral cave open. With a click, the ability suppressor on Subject 757's neck automatically detached. Immediately afterward, he felt a chill on his neck, and his consciousness began to fade. It turned out that George had started casting a spell the moment he saw the two appear, but because the casting motion was so subtle, neither of them had taken it seriously. With the ability suppressor deactivated, the magnetic control exploded, and the dagger he had placed at the door flew up instantly, slicing the guard's neck and temporarily averting the crisis. Swoosh! The instructor drew his dagger from his waist, deflecting the dagger that had attacked from behind. Cold sweat instantly beaded on his forehead. How could this be? If he hadn't reacted in time, he would have suffered the same fate as his subordinate. The moment he saw Subject 757's ability suppressor detach, he, who had spent years teetering on the edge of life and death, immediately became alert and drew his dagger. However, if Subject 757 had attacked him first, he probably still wouldn't have had time to react. You've been hiding your abilities and strength. In his memory, Subject 757's speed and strength in controlling the dagger weren't particularly strong. He could usually deflect it easily. But just now, although he successfully deflected the dagger, his wrist ached slightly from the force of the impact. Dead men don't need to know so much. George controlled the dagger and whoosh destroyed the surveillance camera in the room, then attacked the instructor, who usually could easily defeat him, like a storm. He did indeed possess hidden strength normally, but never this powerful. The main reason was the unexpected enhancement his mutant abilities came from the shared wizard bloodline. Because the dagger was so fast, its angle so tricky, and its power so formidable, the instructor was wounded in just a few rounds. He tried to escape, to get close to George for close combat, but George gave him no chance. So he could only defend as much as possible, hoping a companion would notice the anomaly and come to his rescue. However, George knew that escape time was precious, and he wouldn't waste it here. Give me a gun. While controlling the dagger's attacks, he beckoned to the dead guard, and the submachine gun in the guard's hand immediately flew into his grasp. Goodbye, instructor. Pointing the submachine gun at the instructor who was still struggling to defend against the dagger, George pulled the trigger without hesitation. He wasn't a rigid person who would use a gun unnecessarily, wasting his abilities. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat, oh, God, The instructor's eyes widened in horror at the sight, but before he could finish speaking, he was riddled with bullets. George retrieved his own dagger, taking the instructor's as well. Holding a submachine gun, he stepped out of his cell and stealthily made his way out of the lab. Using his dagger, he destroyed any surveillance cameras or guards he might encounter. Soon, he heard intense gunfire and screams. Clearly, this wasn't just about him, but all the mutant children. Perhaps that was why no guards had arrived in time when problems arose on his side. Compared to him, the mutant children caused far more chaos. This was why he hadn't rushed to escape, waiting until today. If he had tried to escape alone, in this heavily monitored experimental base, he would likely have been surrounded by guards after only a few steps. Facing a barrage of firearms, he wasn't Magneto, he couldn't possibly withstand it. Chapter 12, The Choice, to save or not to save? Whoosh, wielding two daggers, George swiftly slit the throats of two guards before reaching a fork in the road. Based on his understanding and overheard information, the right fork led to the cafeteria, beyond which lay the rooms holding the mutant children. The left led out of the lab. If he went left, with his current strength, he could likely slip out safely, grab a car, and escape. Once he reached a populated area of the city, he'd be free to fly. With the mutant children drawing fire, there probably wouldn't be many pursuers chasing him later. Just as he was about to step onto the left fork, a pitiful scream echoed from the depths of the right fork, a child's voice. This scream made George lower his foot. Sigh, it seems I can't be that rational, that ruthless after all. After a moment's hesitation, he turned and walked to the right. There were 50 mutant children in the entire experimental base, and according to what he had seen in the movies, less than 20 of them, including X-23, escaped. That means more than 30 mutant children died in the escape. George didn't consider himself a good person, but he wasn't a bad person either, he was just a normal person with average morals. Reason told him that in this situation, letting the children draw fire while he quietly escaped was the safest option. But humans aren't machines, how could he be so rational? If the screams had come from adults, he would have hardened his heart and ignored them, since they were strangers. But they were all pitiful children, and he saw them every day. Although he hadn't spoken to them, he knew them. However, he was also very clear-headed. He would try to save them if he could, and if he couldn't, he would run. His own life was the priority. Radisson, Velvet, Ellie. In the cafeteria, Gabriella looked at the three children who had been shot and killed while trying to stop the pursuers, tears welling up in her eyes again. After realizing that the purpose of this genetic modification institute was not to research a cure for cancer, but to train mutant killers, she and several equally kind-hearted colleagues decided to secretly escape with a group of poor children. However, before the plan could be implemented, the institute's higher-ups decided to execute the children en masse. They had to escape prematurely, but even with the children's various amazing abilities, they were no match for the experienced guards wielding cold firearms. Just reaching the canteen, several of her colleagues were killed while providing cover, and more than a dozen of the 50 children were also killed. It was estimated that even more would die if they tried to truly escape. Laura, at this moment, seeing that X-23, the strongest among the children, had been captured and pinned to the air after killing 6 people, Gabriella pulled a submachine gun from a nearby guard's corpse and said to the children behind her, "Go to the entrance. And Issa will take you to your destination." Issa was currently the last surviving colleague, mainly responsible for driving a large truck to transport supplies purchased from the city to the base. After receiving their notification, they had already driven to the entrance to meet them. "What about you and Laura?" The slightly older mutant boy at the head of the group looked worried. Although they had lived in the lab all their lives and lacked common sense, they weren't stupid. "Richard, you're the oldest among them. I'm entrusting them to you. Take them to the destination and wait for me there. I will definitely bring Laura to find you," Gabriella gently instructed the boy, then unleashed a burst of fire from her submachine gun at the opposite side, intending to create an escape opportunity for the children. Her marksmanship wasn't great, but the indiscriminate firing still threw the guards controlling the little wolf girl into panic, causing one of the little wolf girl's feet to break free of its restraints. She fiercely plunged the adamantium claw on that foot into a guard's eye, temporarily freeing herself from her restraints. However, it was clear that more guards were arriving from the other side of the corridor. Seeing this, Rickard gritted his teeth and led his non-blood-related younger brothers and sisters towards the back corridor. They had barely escaped the cafeteria when they were stopped in the corridor by 4 armed guards. Everyone, attack! Despite their fear, they mustered their courage and prepared to fight the 4 guards to the death to escape. Whoosh! Whoosh! But before they could activate their abilities, 2 guards suddenly collapsed to the ground, blood spurting from their necks. The remaining 2 turned around, only to be met with 2 bullets. "Are you alright, George?" Having dealt with the 4 guards, breathed a slight sigh of relief as he looked at the stunned children ahead. There were still 34 children alive. He had arrived just in time. Number 757, Richter was momentarily stunned to discover that his savior was the silent mutant number 757, but he immediately cried out anxiously, "Aunt Gabriella and Laura are still in the cafeteria. I've cleared out the guards behind us. You keep running, I'm going to rescue them." Without hesitation, George threw away his empty submachine gun, grabbed 2 from the guards on the ground, and rushed towards the cafeteria. So ruthless, he'd just rushed into the cafeteria when he saw the little wolf girl straddling a guard's neck, relentlessly attacking his head, splattering his brains. The sight startled the surrounding guards. However, she was too thin, and the guards, reacting quickly, suppressed her with bullets. Although her regenerative abilities prevented her from being killed, she was still shot down from the air and forced to retreat. Gabriella, having run out of ammunition, was pinned behind cover and couldn't offer any help. Fuck, at this point, simply controlling his dagger to kill enemies was clearly insufficient. He didn't have the regenerative ability to withstand so many guns. If he couldn't eliminate them quickly, he would face relentless firepower. So George set up 2 submachine guns, channeling all his magnetic control into the bullets in the magazines, and began a frenzied attack. The bullets, after being fired, didn't follow their original trajectories but were influenced by the magnetic force, forming arcs that aimed at the guards' vital points. The submachine gun's firing rate, approaching the accuracy of a sniper rifle, was his real trump card that allowed him to come and help. Chapter 13: George's Last Gift. Ever since learning that his mutant limits were only level 2, he had been considering how to maximize his abilities. He couldn't make countless bullets or even missiles stop and bounce like Magneto, nor could he lift thousands or tens of thousands of tons, use magnetism to fly, or alter the Earth's magnetic field. However, he felt that the way the instructors at the experimental base trained him to control daggers to kill was incredibly rudimentary. Using daggers was less effective than using needles. At least the number and speed of control would be much greater, and although the power would be less, the effect of attacking vital points like the 7 orifices wouldn't be bad. Of course, after much deliberation, he concluded that to maximize the power of magnetism, he still needed to use firearms. Bullets fired from firearms, in terms of both speed and damage, were far superior to any weapon he could control. With just a slight influence on the bullet's trajectory, he could become a sharpshooter beyond human limits. Right now, he was using submachine guns. If his abilities improved further, and he could control the trajectory of bullets from heavy machine guns, that would be truly formidable. He would be a one-man army, capable of taking down all the guards in the entire base single-handedly. Hurry! With 2 magazines nearly empty and all the guards in the canteen on the ground, George waved to the stunned Gabriella and the bewildered little wolf girl. "Laura, let's go." Gabriella, regaining her senses, quickly grabbed the little wolf girl and ran towards George. She recognized Subject 757, of course, but unlike the other mutant children, this directly generated adult mutant didn't need the nurse's care. He was handled by specialized personnel. However, since he was willing to help, he was definitely not an enemy. Leading Gabriella and the little wolf girl, they ran at breakneck speed, quickly catching up with the children ahead. George, however, dared not be careless, knowing that the guards at this experimental base were far more numerous. The enemy hadn't anticipated this situation and hadn't fully reacted yet. Moreover, it was possible they possessed more powerful and advanced weapons. Despite his earlier display of power, taking down a group of guards in the blink of an eye with 2 submachine guns, that was mainly due to the little wolf girl drawing fire and launching a sneak attack. To be honest, in his current condition, even encountering a sniper would be a huge problem. Some specially made Barrett heavy sniper rifles, with high penetration bullets, can penetrate thick concrete walls with a single shot. If sniped at him from a distance, his magnetic force wouldn't be able to deflect the bullet, and he might be taken down before he could even react. So now is not the time to be complacent. Fortunately, the rest of the journey went smoothly. He didn't encounter the snipers he was worried about, nor the Wolverine clone, and arrived safely outside the experimental base. Do you know roughly where the most important laboratories and data rooms in this base are located? After loading the children onto the truck, George didn't immediately get in but asked Gabriella. Although Gabriella was a little puzzled, she quickly pointed out 2 locations. There and there. Good, let's give them some gifts before we leave. George opened the bag on his back and took out more than a dozen grenades collected from the guards' corpses. Actually, it wasn't just grenades, he also had some cash he'd hastily looted in his bag, just in case he left penniless. Hope you like it. Using his ability, he controlled the grenades, precisely firing them at the 2 locations Gabriella pointed to, then simultaneously pulling the fuses midair. Moments later, a deafening explosion rang out, instantly turning the 2 locations at the experimental base into a sea of fire. Let's go. Seeing that his goal had been achieved, George and the gaping-mouthed Gabriella got into the car. His purpose was simple: if he could kill the high-ranking officials at the experimental base, all the better. If not, he could create chaos, destroy important research data, and slow down the pursuers. And he had indeed achieved his goal. An hour later, a disheveled Dr. Rice slapped Commander Donald across the face, roaring, "Useless trash. I sent you to deal with that garbage, and you've made a mess of it. Most of them escaped, and you destroyed so much of my important data. If X-24 hadn't been unharmed, I'd throw you in the crematorium right now, boss. It was my mistake. I didn't expect the nurses to help them escape," Donald said, oblivious to the pain in his face, bowing respectfully. Dr. Rice took a deep breath, calmed himself, and ordered, "Things are as they are now. I don't want your explanations. I want you to capture those escaped mutant children as quickly as possible and dispose of them. We can't let other organizations find out." As the head of one of the world's most famous companies, with secret connections to many terrorist organizations, he understood that this world was not simple, especially with the existence of a behemoth called SHIELD. If SHIELD discovered the existence of mutants, they would definitely use the mutant clues to find him, and that would be troublesome. Before mass-producing mutants, he didn't want to antagonize SHIELD. "Report to me immediately if anything happens. If necessary, I'll take X-24 to help, and also test its combat effectiveness." "Yes, boss." Donald nodded and left the partially destroyed lab to gather his men. "What are the results of the investigation, Commander?" "According to our investigation, it seems to be caused by Subject 757, according to a captain." Quickly relay the investigation results. Donald frowned upon hearing this. It was him? A mere level 2 mutant. How could he have such strength? He had been in command during the previous battle, so he knew the situation. Although the mutant children had escaped with the help of several nurses, he quickly deployed men to help stabilize the situation. If all went well, they should have been able to stop all the escaped mutant children at the cafeteria, but for some reason, after a burst of gunfire, his men fell silent. He was preparing to take more men to pursue them when the explosion startled him, and he immediately rushed back. There was no other way. There was an explosion site near the boss's lab, and he couldn't afford not to go back. It shouldn't be wrong. Captain Biss, who was in charge of dealing with Subject 757, was killed. Although he destroyed all the surveillance cameras along the way, our trace analysis experts still found traces he left on his way to the cafeteria. However, analyzing the bodies, apart from a few deaths from daggers, most were gunshot wounds, almost all fatal, the squad leader explained. "A sharpshooter? But he doesn't seem to have that ability." Donald frowned, a look of doubt on his face. Mutants with sharpshooter potential usually possess superhuman vision, special motion detection abilities, reaction speeds, etc., and as far as he knew, Subject 757 had telepathic abilities and control over magnetism. Perhaps we should ask the boss about this. He only knew how to command operations. Researching mutant abilities was the boss's business. But thinking about the boss's still angry anger, he gave up. Anyway, he figured even a sharpshooter without specialized training wasn't a big deal. Chapter 14: A Turning Point. "What are your plans? Where are you going?" George asked Nurse Gabriella and the portly female driver, Isa, as they sat in the truck. In the movie, Gabriella sent the mutant children to the North Dakota border, not just because she read comics and thought it was the last refuge for mutants. She wasn't a child. How could she believe things in comics? Besides, Rico, the leader of the mutant children, was also in contact with an unknown force via radio. Because of George's mutant identity and his recent help, Gabriella already trusted him and didn't hide anything. We need to get to the North Dakota border by 5 p.m. next Friday, and then cross the border into Canada. Why Canada? And at that time, George looked puzzled. Gabriella explained, we checked the relevant information. Before mutants disappeared, Canada was the most friendly country to mutants. So before we decided to help the children escape, we proactively contacted the Canadian government. They were willing to accept these children, but didn't want to cause trouble. So we have to get to the border by 5 p.m. next Friday. They will try to interfere with the satellites in that area and then meet us on the other side of the border. Oh, it's the Canadian government, George realized. He had watched the X-Men series, so he understood the general situation, but he didn't know some specific details. He really didn't know about the Canadian government's affinity for mutants, or rather, its lack of prejudice against mutants. However, he then frowned because he personally didn't trust the Canadian government much. A government isn't an individual, it has many things to consider, and a change in leadership can lead to a change in stance. Even if the Canadian government was not prejudiced against mutants before, what about now? Could these mutant children become new experimental subjects after they arrive? He certainly wouldn't choose something without such guarantees. So, he also told Gabriella his thoughts. Gabriella was clearly surprised that George, a mutant who had never left the experimental base, could have such a long-term perspective. However, her answer was also filled with helplessness. There was no other way. Even knowing there might be danger, we had no choice, because we simply couldn't think of a better solution. Working in this cruel experimental base, how could they not understand the ugliness of humanity? How could they not worry that the children would be entering another hell on the other side? But they had no choice, because they were all powerless and from the lowest rungs of society, only their kindness hadn't been extinguished. The children would certainly die if they stayed in this experimental base, but going to Canada might offer some hope. Yes, sometimes life is just so helpless, George sighed upon hearing this. In his previous life, he too had been at the bottom of society, experiencing many such helpless choices, only none as cruel as this. But after careful consideration, he didn't have any better solutions either. He was unfamiliar with this world. But he wouldn't entrust his fate to the Canadian government. After sending these children to the border, he would leave and go into hiding. Risking his life to rescue these children was already an act of kindness and duty. Going to Canada to protect them, only to face restrictions from the Canadian government, was out of the question. Escorting them to the border was his limit. At this moment, he had clearly forgotten the somewhat selfish reason he had given himself at the crossroads. We've reached Juarez. We'll buy some essential supplies and then head straight to the border, then into New Mexico, heading north to North Dakota. If all goes well, it should only take 2 days. After 2 hours of high-speed driving, the truck entered Pierre-Ledovsk, a city in northeastern Mexico. George peered out. He had heard of this city in his previous life, but not for a good reason. Pierre-Ledovsk, on the south bank of the Rio Grande in northeastern Mexico, facing El Paso across the river, was known as one of the most violent cities in the world, with nearly 15,000 people murdered in 6 years at its peak. The city was home to the largest concentration of drug traffickers in Mexico and was a major source of American drugs. Breaking news. Tony Stark, CEO of Stark Industries and the infamous Playboy, was kidnapped today in Gwanar Province, Afghanistan, and his whereabouts remain unknown. A truck pulled up in front of a large supermarket. While Gabriella and Isa went to buy groceries, George, who stayed behind, was suddenly drawn to the news broadcast on the television in front of the supermarket. The Iron Man creation incident, his body jolted, and something suddenly occurred to him. A smile gradually appeared on his face. Perhaps, there's still a new turning point. Recalling all the Marvel movies he had seen in his previous life, he carefully considered the matter and a new idea formed in his mind. For him, it was better to trust Tony Stark's character than the government's. Although this guy was a bit of a womanizer and arrogant, his character was still impeccable. Besides, as one of the biggest capitalists in America, even the government couldn't do anything to him. He could simply hand over the Iron Man suit if he didn't want to. Just like Professor X, the reason he could open a mutant school in New York was not only because of the X-Men's strength, but more importantly, because Professor X himself was a very wealthy man, and his family was also a prominent capitalist family. If they could gain Tony Stark's protection, these mutant children could not only escape a lot of trouble, but might also enjoy a normal education in life. He, too, could have a safe place to study magic. As for whether getting involved with Tony Stark would drag him into later events and expose him to greater danger, that was something he couldn't avoid. He could only resolve the current troubles and gain a relatively safe period to improve his strength as much as possible. Power was the key. Besides, he had his own thoughts on whether to participate in future major events. If this were a movie universe, he would definitely stay far away. Even if Thanos snapped his fingers, he would eventually be saved. There was no need to participate. Studying magic was much better. But this wasn't a movie universe, it was an unknown Marvel universe inhabited by mutants, so it was hard to say. It was very possible that some major event could wipe out the entire Earth, and since he lived on this planet, he wouldn't be able to escape. Rather than entrusting his fate to those superheroes, he would entrust it to himself. Perhaps if he lends a hand at a crucial moment, we can weather those major events and ensure Earth's safety. So contact is inevitable sooner or later. Now, the most important thing is how to rescue Tony Stark and make him owe me a favor, George thought, stroking his chin. To get Tony Stark, this top-tier billionaire, to owe him a favor and genuinely help them, it would have to be a life-saving act. But with his current strength and resources, how could he possibly rescue Tony Stark? He didn't even know his exact location, only that he seemed to be in a cave in some desert. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 15 Searching for Wolverine. Could I borrow your phone for a moment? George asked Gabriella immediately as the truck started moving again. Before figuring out how to rescue Tony Stark, he needed to understand the history and circumstances of this world to make more accurate judgments and develop a more comprehensive plan. And in this era, the fastest way was naturally to use a mobile phone to go online and learn about it. Of course, here you go. Gabriella took out her phone from her pocket and handed it to George without hesitation. With the phone in hand, George began searching for the information he wanted to know online. He didn't return the phone to Gabriella until the truck entered the Mexican border and it gradually got dark. I see. Actually, the history of this universe wasn't much different from the movie universe, except that it included some mutant elements. According to online news reports, mutants were truly understood by the public in 1973. Mystique, a mutant, attempted to assassinate Trask, but was ultimately stopped. Mystique became a hero among mutants, and humanity gradually began to accept the existence of mutants. In 1977, Quicksilver broke 8 world records in sports, and the sports world began to ban mutants from participating in professional sports competitions. This conflicted with the cinematic universe, because according to the cinematic universe, Quicksilver wasn't even born that year. Both Quicksilver and Wanda in the cinematic universe were born in 1990. This also reminded him that many things in the future couldn't be handled entirely according to the movie plots he watched. Afterwards, the X-Men superhero organization became wildly popular, leading to numerous X-Men-related comics, one of which was the one little wolf girl and her friends possessed. Many stories in it were based on real X-Men events, but there was also a lot of fiction, such as the so-called Garden of Eden. In 1983, the Apocalypse event occurred, and shortly after, the Westchester incident happened. Professor X suffered an epileptic seizure, his brain went out of control, and he killed all the X-Men except Wolverine, as well as the mutant students at the school, and over 600 innocent humans nearby. From then on, Professor X was listed as a weapon of mass destruction by the US government and was wanted by the authorities, and mutants began to disappear. Now, more than 20 years later, most people have forgotten the existence of mutants, and many of the younger generation only consider them fictional characters from comic books. For some reason, governments around the world have consistently downplayed the history of mutants, seemingly trying to prove that governments are humanity's greatest asset, not mutant superheroes. Before 1973, there was almost no news of mutants, which led to Steve Rogers becoming Captain America in 1943 through the super soldier serum and defeating Hydra. This was likely because Wolverine and Sabretooth were still ordinary soldiers at the time, Professor X and Magneto were children, and the Hellfire Club was operating in the shadows. Have you considered looking for Wolverine and Professor X who might still exist? George already had a general plan in mind. Although the history of this universe conflicted with his knowledge in many ways, Some things remained largely unchanged. He couldn't rely entirely on known information, but he also couldn't completely abandon his advantage in this area. At least the initial reason for Tony Stark's kidnapping was most likely Obadiah Stanislavski's desire to kill Tony Stark and seize control of Stark Industries. However, his telepathic abilities weren't enough to extract information about the 10 rings from Obadiah Stanislavski and locate Tony Stark's whereabouts. Professor X was needed. Professor X suffers from epilepsy, causing occasional lapses in mental control, but medication has significantly improved his condition, and he's generally lucid. While he may not be as powerful as before, simple telepathic memory reading should still be possible. After all, he can occasionally chat with Wolverine from a distance. With Wolverine as a human shield, combined with his abilities, rescuing Tony Stark shouldn't be too difficult. Although Wolverine is old, he's not someone ordinary terrorists can stop when he's serious. Furthermore, Gabriella took several temporary mutant enhancement drugs with her when she escaped, restoring some of Wolverine's strength. Most importantly, both of them have extensive experience in planning and executing missions, something he, Gabriella, and the group of mutant children lack. Frankly, he's completely clueless about things abroad, even less so than Gabriella. We've thought about it. We've been looking for information about them, but all we've heard is that someone who looks like Wolverine is working as a driver in El Paso, and that's it. Besides, Professor X is a wanted criminal. He might not be able to help us, Gabriella replied helplessly. George nodded in agreement. In some ways, Gabriella's thinking wasn't wrong. Wolverine and his crew were indeed in dire straits. I have a plan now. If it succeeds, the children might not need to be controlled by anyone in the future and could live like normal people, without any concealment. He told Gabriella his entire plan. His thinking was simple. If Gabriella agreed, he was willing to put in the extra effort to help, considering it an investment in the future. If Gabriella disagreed, he wouldn't force her. He wasn't a pushover. After delivering the children to their destination, he would leave alone to complete the plan and settle down in New York. Besides, his choice might not be the best for the children. Perhaps they would be better off in Canada. Hearing George's plan, Gabriella fell into deep thought. At this moment, she was deeply conflicted. To be honest, she didn't have much faith in the Canadian government either. As a Mexican who grew up in Juarez, she found it difficult to have much confidence in the government. However, George's plan was also very risky. If George and his team failed to rescue Tony Stark and missed the agreed-upon time with the Canadian government, the children would inevitably be captured and brutally killed by the people at the experimental base. And would Wolverine and Professor X be willing to help? Seeing Gabriella's inner turmoil, George added, if Wolverine and Professor X are unwilling to help, or if we don't return by 5 p.m. on Friday, you should cross the border to Canada as planned. Today was Saturday, and there were 6 days until next Friday. If all went smoothly, 6 days would be enough for them to rescue Tony Stark. Okay, George, thank you so much, Gabriella nodded gratefully. Actually, George could have left on his own without their help. With his abilities and demonstrated intelligence, escaping the lab's pursuit wouldn't have been difficult. But he chose to stay and help them, to find a better way for them to survive. No need. Speaking of which, I'm just like them, an experimental subject at the research facility. I'm practically their older brother, George said with a smile. Actually, based on the time of creation, you should be the youngest among them. Gabriella seemed to have thought of something and suddenly laughed. George couldn't help but smile in response. That's right, it's been less than a year since his body was created, making him the youngest mutant in the lab. Chapter 16 The Wolf's Concerns. El Paso County, Texas, early morning. Logan, exhausted from dropping off his last passenger, was asleep in his rented limousine when he was jolted awake by the noise outside. Damn it, he cursed angrily, struggling to get up and open the door. He often encountered this. It was always those smugglers from Mexico, eyeing his luxury car and wanting to remove the wheels to sell for money. However, he couldn't let them succeed this time. He needed money to earn a living with this rented car. His professor needed money for medication, and he had been saving to buy a yacht and take his professor to live a safe life on the high seas. After living for so many years and experiencing the deaths of friends and loved ones, he was actually tired of his life. His only thought now was to give his only surviving old friend, Charles, who had once saved him, a decent old age. If he let these smugglers remove the wheels, he would not only have to pay the rental company, but he would also lose his stable job. Hey, These nuts are all chrome-plated, and you've ruined them all. You guys, get out of here." Holding onto the car door, Logan tried to persuade the thugs to leave without resorting to violence, but to no avail. Upon seeing their owner, the thugs didn't run away immediately. Instead, they fired a shot at Logan and continued removing the wheels. Killing seemed as simple to them as eating and drinking. Logan's healing factor was significantly weakened by the toxins in the adamantium, but the injuries weren't enough to kill him. He slowly unleashed his claws and began fighting the thugs. However, due to his aging body and lack of rest, he was quickly overwhelmed by the 6 thugs and knocked to the ground, only able to protect his head with his hands, waiting for an opportunity to retaliate. "George, can he really help us now?" Gabriella asked worriedly from inside the truck. They changed course and drove to Ilbazo County. After a full 4 hours of searching, they finally found Wolverine Logan's trail, but the current situation made her somewhat lose hope. George smiled and nodded, "Of course, and I can be a great help. Don't let Wolverine's current state fool you. When he really gets angry, even several of them wouldn't be a match for him. If a way to cure the adamantium poison can be found in the future, Wolverine's body will return to its peak youthful state. You know, Apocalypse, who also possesses the healing factor, has lived for thousands of years without aging. You guys wait here for me, I'll go talk to him first." Pushing open the car door, George jumped out and used his ability to control 2 daggers to slash at the necks of the thugs. He naturally showed no mercy to these thugs who had no moral bottom line and killed innocent people at will, aiming for vital organs. Swish 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 swish, several sounds of tracheas being cut by sharp blades rang out, and the thugs who were kicking Wolverine instantly clutched their necks and collapsed in disbelief. Wolverine, sensing something amiss, loosened his grip, looking equally surprised. Just then, a hand reached out to him. "Are you alright, Wolverine Logan, friend? You might have mistaken me for someone else. I'm not Wolverine, but thank you for your help anyway." Logan didn't reach out, but slowly stood up on his own. George didn't seem to mind, withdrawing his hand and continuing, "My name is George, I'm a mutant. We have 35 mutant children here. And we need your and Professor's help." "Mutants? Mutants disappeared long ago. There are no mutants left in this world, and there's no Wolverine or Professor." Wolverine shook his head, somewhat laboriously crouching down to pick up the scattered nuts and bolts on the ground to put the car's tires back on. George waved his hand, and the scattered nuts and bolts instantly floated up and landed in his hand. There are indeed very few naturally occurring mutants left, but there are still quite a few mutants created through artificial experiments. For example, I am a mutant synthesized using the genes of Professor X and Magneto. "Who exactly are you?" Wolverine's eyes lit up with wariness as he saw the nut floating in the air, and he extended his claws again, though one was stuck halfway. George paused for a moment, then waved towards the truck parked on the roadside not far away. A moment later, Gabriella, along with the little wolf girl and 35 other mutant children, slowly walked over. "Show Mr. Logan your abilities." The little wolf girl extended her adamantium claws. Ricto raised an earthen wall from the ground, and the other children each used their own abilities, controlling wind, fire, plants, water, electricity, and even breathing cold air. Although the power was not yet fully developed, it undeniably proved their mutant identity. Mr. Logan, George isn't lying to you. We just escaped from the genetic modification lab in Mexico City. Gabriella recounted her experience and the situation at the lab in detail. After listening, Wolverine took a deep breath, looked at George and the children, and reluctantly refused. "I'm afraid I can't, and am not capable of, helping you." His own life or death didn't matter, but the professor's current situation didn't allow him to get involved in such troublesome matters. A mishandling of the situation could lead to the professor's death. So even though he couldn't bear it, he still refused. Gabriella's eyes dimmed immediately upon hearing this, but George had expected it and didn't give up. He knew the reason for Wolverine's refusal and also knew that Wolverine was essentially a kind person. As long as he gave him a reasonable way out, it would be easy to persuade him. At the experimental base, I accidentally saw some intelligence related to the Westchester incident. Your hard work driving around earning money is probably also to cure the professor's illness. Helping us is actually helping the professor, and helping yourself. If our plan goes according to plan, the professor will receive the world's best medicine and equipment, and might even recover. But have you considered that the famous playboy Tony Stark might not repay us, but might even betray us? Not everyone in this world is willing to repay you after being saved. Many, for their own benefit, might even retaliate against you with even greater cruelty. Wolverine paused for a moment before replying. He knew this all too well. Once, on the battlefield of World War II, he saved an officer, only to find that the officer, nearing death, coveted his healing factor and wanted to kill him to steal it and survive. Chapter 17 Border Factory. Hearing Wolverine's words, George not only showed no worry but also smiled. Since Wolverine was already considering this possibility, it meant he was right. Wolverine was all bark and no bite, and deep down he still wanted to help. We need to meet Tony Stark to judge him. If he's not trustworthy, you can get a substantial reward and leave. With the money, you can take the professor and live the life you want, without worrying about us anymore. What do you think? I need to think about it. Wolverine took a bottle of strong liquor from the car seat, gulped it down, then closed his eyes and pondered for a long time before slowly replying, "Okay, I agree to help you, but on one condition: you can't take the professor. The professor's condition isn't as good as you think. He can't actively control his abilities, and if he appears in New York, it will cause panic in the government, making things even more troublesome." No problem, George thought for a moment and nodded. He was only thinking about using Professor X's abilities, forgetting the impact of Professor X's weapon of mass destruction entering New York. It might even attract SHIELD, so it's better not to bring him. At worst, they can torture Obadiah. Under the threat of death, he'll honestly reveal Tony Stark's whereabouts. Actually, this is good too. Professor X is still physically limited, and with just him and Wolverine, they'll be much more efficient. Let's get out of here quickly. Those thugs just fired. The police will probably be here soon. Seeing that George had reached an agreement, Gabriella breathed a sigh of relief, then quickly reminded him, looking at the corpses of the thugs on the ground. Wolverine bent down again, preparing to put the wheels back on. Don't worry, it's precisely because of the gunshots that the police won't arrive so quickly. Okay, they're really dedicated. At this moment, George also squatted down, his hands constantly changing hand gestures. Restore to original. The restoration spell took effect, and the wheels that had been removed immediately and automatically returned to their original positions. This was the second spell he could currently cast using hand gestures. It seems you have more than just Professor X and Magneto's genes in you. Wolverine looked surprised. George chuckled and shrugged. Actually, I'm not sure exactly how many genes they've incorporated into me. Your situation reminds me of a very talkative friend of mine. He also had a lot of mutant genes implanted in him and his mouth was sealed shut. Wolverine sighed, recalling memories deep within his mind. Unfortunately, they're all gone now, friends, the old go and the new come. Life goes on, don't be so pessimistic. George casually offered a word of comfort. Actually, he had always had a question in his mind. Had the current Wolverine experienced days of future past? Did he have memories of two different timelines, or was there simply no two timelines in this universe? In X-Men's Days of Future Past, changing the past changes the present. But in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, changing the past only creates a new timeline and doesn't affect the present. However, he couldn't ask about this now, he could only wait until they were more familiar with each other. Wolverine looked at him with some surprise. Looks like you really do have some of the professor's genes. The car was repaired, and Wolverine led the way in his luxury limousine. With Isa driving the van with George and the children following closely behind, heading towards the border. The professor's situation was special, so Wolverine had hidden him in a sparsely populated border area. This used to be a factory run by a multinational smelting company headquartered in Shanghai, but it had to be abandoned due to the chaotic security situation. Normally, no one would come here, Wolverine explained to George as the car stopped in front of an abandoned factory on the border. It was precisely because El Paso bordered Mexico, with a large number of Mexicans illegally crossing over to live there, and the security situation so chaotic, that they were able to remain hidden. In a safer city, it would be impossible to hide. Logan, who are they? At this moment, a man wearing a scarf and hat, with only his eyes showing, cautiously emerged from the factory, looking at George and the group of mutant children with some confusion. Caliban, these kids are all mutants. Come in first, I'll explain in more detail later. Wolverine waved and led everyone into the factory. George glanced at the man wrapped in a scarf, and relevant information flashed through his mind. Caliban, a mutant with the ability to track mutants, was once a black market merchant who made huge profits by selling mutant tracks. He also helped the Arclay Genetics Corporation hunt down mutants for money. Later, He developed albinism and could no longer see the sun. He began to repent for his crimes and started helping Wolverine and Professor X hide their tracks. In the end, after witnessing Professor X's death, he detonated 2 grenades in grief, taking the enemy with him. So, for now, he can be considered a mutant who can be trusted. No wonder he always said he was communicating with some people, that there were many new mutants. It turns out there really are. But Logan, are you really going to do this? It's dangerous. Inside the factory, after listening to Logan's words, Caliban's brows furrowed tightly. He felt sympathy for the mutant children, but he was more worried about Wolverine's safety. Only the 3 of them remained of the older generation of mutants, and after years of living together, he had come to consider Wolverine and Professor X his only family. George is right. Maybe this is the only way to truly cure Professor X. You know that water tank can't hold him. This can't go on forever. We need money, better equipment, and better medicine to treat him. Besides, I don't believe the Canadian government will treat those children well. Human governments are all bad. Wolverine tossed a bag of medicine and a card to Caliban. This medicine will last Professor X a month. This card contains all the money I've saved over the years. I was planning to buy a yacht and take you and Professor X to live on the high seas. If something happens and I don't come back, I'll have to trouble you to take care of Professor X. Alright, I know I can't stop you. I can only tell you that if you don't come back, I won't take care of that troublesome old man alone. I'll abandon him and leave with this money. Caliban took the medicine and card, remained silent for a moment, and finally replied with a smile. Wolverine smiled, a rare occurrence for him. You wouldn't, otherwise you wouldn't have given up all that money you'd saved to help us. It's your turn to feed him the medicine. I've been up all night. Caliban shook his head helplessly, taking a bottle of medicine from the bag and placing it in Wolverine's hand. Clearly, Wolverine had guessed right. Chapter 18 Encirclement and Counterattack. Is this the famous Professor X? He looks much younger than in the movies, George thought to himself, watching Wolverine push Professor X out of the water tank. It made sense. In the movies, it was 2029, so Professor X would be 97 years old, but in reality, it was 2009, and he was 77. If we could restore Professor X's abilities, his safety would be guaranteed. Even if he couldn't fully recover his abilities, restoring his sanity would help these children develop their powers better. At this moment, he decided that when he went to Hogwarts to study magic, he would spend more time on healing magic. If modern technology couldn't cure Professor X, he would try using magical means. After all, Professor X was the most powerful telepath in the world. He could read people's thoughts and memories without physical contact, directly stripping and controlling their minds and actions through his telepathic abilities. With a brainwave enhancement machine, he could even kill all ordinary humans and mutants on Earth. A new species, new mutants. Good, Logan, you must help them, they need you. Professor X looked at the children standing in front of him, especially Laura, and tears streamed down his face. He gripped Wolverine's hand tightly. Wait a little longer, just a little longer, you'll have a new family. Don't give up on yourself, everything will be alright, then promise me, you won't give up either. They need your guidance too, just as you guided us. Wolverine's eyes slowly hardened, as if he had transformed back into the fearless fighter he once was. At this moment, George approached. There's no time to lose. Those people at the experimental base won't let us off so easily. We can't stay here too long. Now we'll split into 2 groups. Logan and I will go to New York to try and rescue Tony Stark. Professor, Caliban, Gabriella, and Isa, you take the children to the North Dakota border and wait for our news. Be careful, the experimental base has created a clone of Logan. Caliban, you need to keep an eye out for any new mutants approaching. If you spot one, you must move them immediately. A clone of Logan. Caliban's pupils contracted, then he pointed south. If I'm not mistaken, the guy you're talking about is here. Following Caliban's finger, a long convoy was faintly visible on the empty land in the distance. George's eyes narrowed. Sooner than I expected. Good, we can take this opportunity to deal with him, otherwise it will cause trouble later. He had anticipated the pursuit from the experimental base. With the financial resources and status of Arclay Genetics, obtaining the relevant surveillance footage through local agencies was not difficult. With a truck that big, hiding their tracks was impossible. Before, being caught would have been troublesome, because even if he could use magnetism to change bullet trajectories and become a super sharpshooter, it would be useless against X-24. Running out of ammo meant certain death. But now it was different. It wasn't that Wolverine could defeat X-24, but that he knew Wolverine had an adamantium bullet, originally saved for suicide, which would be perfect against X-24. Killing X-24 would temporarily eliminate much danger at the experimental base, and creating another Wolverine clone wouldn't be quick. This way, they could rescue Tony Stark without worrying about the children being threatened by the experimental base. If they could also take down Sander Rice, that would be even better. I have a plan, he said, turning to Wolverine and quickly explaining his strategy. Meanwhile, Commander Donald, sitting in an armed jeep, was also making strategic deployments via walkie-talkie. Surround the factory completely in a moment. Don't let a single one escape. If there's any unusual movement, shoot them dead, especially the test subject 757. Following the boss's orders, he mobilized all available connections and quickly located the truck's trail. He also discovered that the escaped mutants had made contact with Wolverine, who was living in seclusion in El Paso. They already knew about Wolverine and the professor's whereabouts. The reason they hadn't hunted them down like they did with other mutants was because the boss had said that letting them live like this, barely surviving, was more painful than killing them. However, now that the escaped mutant children were mixed up with Wolverine and his group, things were a bit complicated. So, after obtaining the boss's permission, they brought X-24 this time, just in case. Originally, the boss wanted to come and see X-24's combat effectiveness in person, but he had been injured in the lab explosion and was also worried about 757's marksmanship, so he stayed at the base. The convoy, consisting of over 20 vehicles, completely surrounded the dilapidated factory. Each vehicle was filled with burly men in bulletproof vests, heavily armed, who disembarked and took up firing positions, numbering nearly 100. A short distance away, a sniper was lurking on the roof of an armored vehicle almost the size of a bus, inside which lay the final trump card, the X-24. I never expected to meet you like this, Wolverine, my former idol. Hand over those kids, and I won't disturb your peaceful life with that old man. Donald removed his sunglasses, hands behind his back, and sized up Wolverine, who stood alone at the factory gate, his tone full of mockery. He clearly didn't take the once famous Wolverine seriously at all. Excuse me, I don't know what you're talking about. This is private property. Please leave. Remembering George's stalling strategy, Wolverine resisted the urge to stab the bastard to death with his claws and patiently pleaded. Donald pointed to the large truck at the entrance. You've disappointed me too much? You probably can't afford the price of lying to me. I don't know whose truck it is, and the person you're looking for isn't here. Wolverine still denied it outright. Donald gestured to his men behind him, and more than 20 men immediately rushed into the factory with guns drawn. About 5 minutes later, they came out of the factory and shook their heads at Donald. Donald raised an eyebrow, looked around, and finally smiled as he fixed his gaze on the abandoned water tank next to the factory. That's a good idea. I bet they're there, including that old guy. That's just an ordinary water tank. The person you're looking for really isn't here. Wolverine's expression changed, and he slowly put one hand into his pocket. Donald ignored Wolverine and directly signaled his men to search the water tank. Just then, Wolverine quickly pulled a vial of reagent from his pocket and swiftly injected it into his arm. Chapter 19, I've decided on you, little wolf girl. Not good. Realizing what was happening, Donald immediately retreated. He recognized the reagent. It was the very one their experimental base had developed, a drug specifically designed to temporarily enhance the abilities of mutants. Once injected, Wolverine's strength would return to its peak before the drug wore off. A peak Wolverine was an absolutely terrifying assassin. Sniper, target Wolverine. However, the response over the walkie-talkie was, X-23 and subject 757 spotted. They're heading this way. Release X-24 to take them out. You continue sniping Wolverine. After assigning his subordinates to take over, Donald ordered the sniper. He didn't know how X-23 and subject 757 had escaped so silently from their tight encirclement, but it didn't matter. Releasing X-24 would definitely take care of them. According to experimental data, X-23 was no match for X-24, and even with subject 757's excellent marksmanship, he couldn't harm X-24. They were completely countered. The most important thing now is that Wolverine, now back to his peak condition after being given medication, has already killed 10 of his elite men amidst the hail of bullets and heavy encirclement. If they don't use a sniper rifle to restrict his movement, he and everyone else might be wiped out by Wolverine. No wonder the boss is so fond of Wolverine. Roger, a sniper fired, and Wolverine was hit and knocked down. The others immediately swarmed him, suppressing him with bullets to prevent him from getting up. Meanwhile, George and the little wolf girl were running towards the bus. They hadn't escaped from the encirclement, they had left the factory before the enemy surrounded them and hid behind nearby obstacles. Once the enemy's attention was completely drawn to Wolverine, they stealthily rushed towards the vehicle clearly holding X-24. If they could eliminate X-24 beforehand, they would have won a large part of the battle. However, what he hadn't expected was that the enemy valued them so much, even bringing a sniper, something that didn't happen in the movies. Fortunately, just in case, he had brought along the formidable wolf girl. If the sniper aimed at him, well, he would simply use the wolf girl as a shield. After all, with the wolf girl's regenerative abilities, even if she were hit by a sniper rifle, she wouldn't be killed. Although it was somewhat cruel, there was no other way if it really came to that. It was a life or death battle. If they lost, it wouldn't just be him who died, but everyone, including the 30-odd mutant children. The only problem was that the wolf girl's body was too small to completely shield him. He could only use her to cover his upper body, as there were more vital points on the upper body. His two legs, which were moving rapidly, weren't so easy to hit. However, he had wizard blood, giving him incredible vitality. Even if he was accidentally shot, as long as it wasn't a vital point, he wouldn't die easily. Once he got closer, he could influence the sniper. Currently, he couldn't change the trajectory of the sniper bullet, but he could affect the sniper rifle itself, making it shake and unable to aim. In fact, the situation was better than he had expected. The sniper didn't turn his gun on them, but continued aiming at the factory. Clearly, Wolverine had drawn enough attention for them. However, he didn't ignore them either, releasing the ferocious-looking X-24. Good. Seeing the back door of the bus open, Wolverine's clone, X-24, leaped out, roaring as it charged towards them. George's face lit up with joy. This move was exactly what he wanted. 4 elite soldiers disembarked with X-24, but instead of coming with it, they set up a camera, seemingly intending to record X-24's battle. These soldiers knew how terrifying X-24 was and didn't believe X-23 and Experiment 757 could win. Recording X-24's battle was the boss's request, as this was essentially a practical test of X-24, and the video would definitely be recorded for later analysis. As he drew closer to X-24, George scooped up the little wolf girl and fired 2 shots from his submachine gun. He didn't immediately use adamantium bullets because if he killed X-24 now, the sniper would react quickly, and the others would concentrate their attacks on him. That would be dangerous. He didn't want to use the little wolf girl as a shield unless absolutely necessary. So he wanted to take advantage of the enemy's momentary lapse in attention to get as close as possible. Once the distance was within his range, his marksmanship would be on full display. Bang! Bang! 2 bullets flew straight towards X-24's eyes. The bullets wouldn't kill X-24, but the eye injury would take time to heal. Seeing George shooting at him, X-24 immediately raised his arm to shield himself. Unfortunately, George's bullets weren't straight, they curved before hitting X-24's arm, ultimately striking his eyes precisely. X-24's eyeball exploded, and she immediately let out a scream before stopping. The eyeball could regenerate, but the pain wouldn't lessen. I choose you, little wolf girl. Taking advantage of X-24's still regenerating eye, George flung the little wolf girl away with all his might. Go take out that sniper. The little wolf girl flew over X-24's head, landed with a tactical roll, and charged towards the sniper and 4 soldiers on the bus without hesitation. By this time, X-24's eyeball had regenerated, and she immediately lashed out with a claw at George, so fast that George didn't have time to react. Whoosh! Although George retreated in time, the submachine gun in his hand was still split in 2 by X-24's claw. The second claw then went for George's neck. She's really ruthless, George gasped, then unleashed his full magnetic power, concentrating it on X-24's arm. Although he wasn't Magneto, capable of easily manipulating Wolverine whose body was filled with adamantium, the force of several dozen kilograms applied to X-24's arm would definitely have a significant impact. Sure enough, due to the magnetic force, X-24's arm momentarily paused, allowing George to dodge again. George didn't linger, taking the opportunity to bypass X-24 and rush towards the bus. Feeling toyed with by George, X-24 instantly flew into a rage, turning and continuing its pursuit. George, however, didn't engage in a direct confrontation. He knew he couldn't win by force. He simply used his magnetic force to influence X-24's limbs, skillfully dodging X-24's attacks and steadily closing in on the bus. Unfortunately, he hadn't had his powers for very long. Even with the enhancements from his wizard bloodline, he hadn't fully developed them yet. Originally, his body's maximum magnetic control was 100 kilograms, but initially he could only use 10 kilograms. Later, with a wizard bloodline, he could now use several dozen kilograms. If he's given a few more years to adapt, his strength will likely reach its limit. Perhaps several hundred kilograms. Several hundred kilograms would be enough to lift X-24 into the air and torment it at will. Or, if he studies magic for a while longer, a single stun spell could easily take him down. In short, the future is promising, but not yet. This is the only way to proceed. Chapter 20. Thanks to my friend for sending the sniper rifle. As George somewhat clumsily dodged the X-24's attacks and steadily approached the bus, the little wolf girl had already sprinted to its front. The 4 soldiers filming immediately drew their submachine guns and unleashed a barrage of fire upon her approach. The little wolf girl, with her extensive combat experience, leaped and tumbled like a real wolf, dodging most of the bullets aimed at vital organs. Enduring the pain of the remaining bullets, she fiercely pounced on the 4 men. She had received rigorous training in various killing techniques since childhood, and this kind of combat was nothing new to her. The sniper on the bus, hearing the commotion below, sensed danger and immediately abandoned his support for sniping Wolverine in the factory, instead turning his gun to target the little wolf girl below. Having just killed 2 soldiers, the little wolf girl was immediately shot in the chest. This shot was unlike any other. Its power was astonishing, sending her flying with a scream of agony. Taking advantage of the moment, the remaining 2 soldiers quickly stepped forward and pinned down the little wolf girl's arms and legs, preventing her from getting up. The little wolf girl was still just a child. Despite her impressive physical abilities and killing skills, she was no match for an adult in terms of pure strength, especially against these 2 muscular men. No matter how much she struggled, she couldn't get up. Let's see if you can recover after I blow your head off. The sniper turned to look at Experiment 757, who was fleeing in disarray under X-24's attack. He estimated she wouldn't last much longer, so a cruel look appeared on his face as he aimed his rifle at the little wolf girl's head, which was pinned to the ground. He didn't believe the little wolf girl could survive a sniper shot to the head. If 1 shot didn't kill her, 2, 3 would do. If she really didn't die, hearing her scream under his gun wouldn't be a bad thing. That's enough. At this moment, George also noticed the little wolf girl was subdued. He calculated the distance and knew it was time to act. He unleashed his full power on X-24's ankle, causing her to stumble and miss her attack. Taking advantage of this moment, instead of continuing to flee, he drew the pistol he had been concealing in his chest. He released the safety and pressed the pistol against X-24's temple. Game over. Bang! A gunshot rang out, the first adamantium bullet chambered, shooting into X-24's head and killing her instantly. Hearing the gunshot, the sniper, who had been preparing to blow the little wolf girl's head off, instinctively looked up towards Subject 757. His expression changed drastically when he saw X-24 lying motionless. He quickly turned his gun around, aiming at Subject 757 who was sprinting towards them. How could this be? However, he then discovered that his sniper rifle was shaking uncontrollably, even threatening to fly out of his hand. Despite his best efforts to suppress it, it only worsened. How could he aim accurately with a gun shaking like this? He managed to fire a few shots, all of which missed. Bang! Bang! Using the remote-controlled sniper rifle, he dodged several shots with an S-shaped movement, and seeing the effective range of his pistol, George raised his hand and fired 2 shots at the 2 burly men restraining the little wolf girl. The 2 men fell to the ground, their heads exploding, while the little wolf girl broke free. Her claws digging into the bus roof. She quickly climbed up and pounced on the sniper. She was very vengeful. If someone had hurt her with a gun, she would hurt him back. Commander, X-24 is dead. Watch out for X-23 and the experimental subjects. Seeing X-23 rushing towards him, the sniper knew he was doomed and hurriedly reported to Commander Donald via walkie-talkie. However, He was only halfway through his report when a bullet pierced his chest. George arrived at the bottom of the bus and saw the blood-soaked little wolf girl dragging the sniper's body off the roof. He couldn't help but twitch his lips. "Alright, it's alright now, leave the rest to me." He patted the little wolf girl's head, picked her up, and grabbed the 4 soldiers' submachine guns and sniper rifles. He then went to the driver's seat of the bus. If it weren't for the special circumstances, he wouldn't have wanted the still childish wolf girl to join such a brutal battle. He placed the little wolf girl in the passenger seat, touched the sniper rifle, and couldn't help but exclaim, "Thanks for the sniper rifle, buddy." His current abilities weren't enough to change the trajectory of sniper bullets, but that didn't mean he couldn't in the future. Just imagine a sniper rifle with a range of over 2,000 meters, hitting its target every time, and even capable of curving. What a powerful weapon. He started the bus and drove straight towards the factory. Once within his range, he smashed the windshield, positioned the 4 submachine guns in front, and unleashed a barrage of fire, countless bullets arcing through the air. Inside the factory, Donald looked at Wolverine, who was kneeling on the ground, panting heavily, and mocked, "The drug's worn off, huh? Let's see how long you can hold out. To tell you the truth, your backup plan, that test subject 757 and X-23, will probably be captured by my men soon, and then we'll send you both on your way." But before he could finish speaking, a sniper's report and screams came through the walkie-talkie. Wolverine laughed loudly, relying on his strong willpower to stand up again. "Looks like we're sending you on your way, Commander. It's bad. The bus is rushing towards the factory. Our men can't hold it off." At this moment, a squad leader rushed in from outside the factory. Good, this won't end like this. Retreat." Looking at Wolverine standing there, his remaining fighting strength unknown, and hearing the intense gunfire and screams outside, Donald gritted his teeth and led his remaining 20-odd men to a vehicle and escape. Seeing Donald finally escape, Wolverine collapsed to the ground, unable to hold on any longer. Moments later, a bus crashed through the factory gate and stopped in front of Wolverine. The door opened, and George and the little wolf girl jumped out. "Are you alright, Logan?" "I'm not dead yet. Those sons of bitches, if it were 20 years ago, none of them would have escaped." Wolverine struggled to his feet. "Don't swear in front of the children, but Logan, your performance just now was no worse than 20 years ago." At this moment, Professor X pushed his wheelchair out of the water tank with everyone else. George said, "Although we've temporarily repelled them, it's not safe to stay here any longer. According to the previous plan, everyone should gather up a bit and split into 2 groups to leave quickly. George, we've decided, we're not going to Canada. The professor is right. If we rush before Friday, the time is too tight, and it's too dangerous for you. We can't be so selfish." At this moment, Gabriella suddenly stood up and spoke to George. Chapter 21: The Professor's Proposal. Just now, in the water tank, Gabriella and Isa witnessed the entire battle outside through the monitor, gaining a clearer understanding of Wolverine and George's fighting capabilities. This, coupled with the professor's words to them, further solidified their confidence. According to the professor, reaching New York and finding news of Tony Stark within 6 days to launch a rescue operation in the Middle East was virtually impossible. Even if they succeeded, it would be fraught with danger, essentially risking Wolverine and George's lives. Moreover, the experienced professor advised against the children going to Canada to have their future arranged by the Canadian government. Therefore, after careful consideration and discussion, they decided to completely abandon their previous cooperation with the Canadian government, forego traveling to the North Dakota border, and instead find a safe place to settle down first. Then they would carefully plan how to rescue Tony Stark. Even if the plan ultimately failed, as long as they worked together, they could defeat the seemingly invincible people at the experimental base and ensure the children's survival. Even with such a large force, the enemy was routed this time. Previously, they thought it was impossible for them to stand against the powerful Arclay Genetics Corporation alone, but now it seems not entirely impossible. As expected of Professor X, even without his abilities, his persuasive skills are truly unmatched. George's eyes lit up upon hearing Gabriella's reply. He naturally agreed with Gabriella's decision. Rescuing Tony Stark in 6 days, although due to his plot advantage, wasn't as life or death as the professor described, it was still no easy feat. New York was a place of complex power struggles. Who could guarantee everything would go smoothly? If they had ample time to prepare, if his abilities were further developed, perhaps allowing him to deflect sniper bullets, or if he learned more magic at Hogwarts, the success rate would naturally increase significantly. Crucially, if he remembered correctly, Tony Stark told Pepper in the movie that he had been imprisoned in a cave for over 3 months. So, normally, they didn't need to rush. Or, if he becomes powerful enough in the next few months to buy Stark Industries stock, then whether or not he rescues Tony Stark seems irrelevant. He rescues Tony Stark for money, so Tony Stark can protect them and allow them to live a normal life. But if they are powerful enough and have money, there's no need to seek out Tony Stark. Because cooperating with Tony Stark will inevitably attract the attention of SHIELD, and being noticed by SHIELD means being noticed by Hydra, thus getting into even bigger trouble. 6 days is indeed a tight time frame. Since you've made your decision, let's leave here first, find a safe place, and then discuss what to do next. George nodded to Gabriella, then led everyone to collect the submachine guns and grenades from the corpses, and quickly left the abandoned factory. In the current situation, as long as they leave the border now and go to a slightly farther place, it will be very difficult for the people at the experimental base to reorganize their forces and find them. Arclay Genetics could access surveillance footage from this small border town because the area was chaotic enough that many things could be done with money. However, they weren't legitimate national organizations like SHIELD, the FBI, or the CIA. Ostensibly, they were just businessmen, and couldn't possibly have influence throughout the entire United States, otherwise, they would have been eliminated long ago. In the movie, if Donald hadn't used Caliban's tracking abilities, he wouldn't have found Wolverine and the Professor X so easily. And now that X-24 was dead, before creating new clones, they probably wouldn't be pursued again, they simply couldn't win. So, barring any unforeseen circumstances, after this major battle, the experimental base should remain quiet for several months, allowing them to focus on planning their next move. On the highway, Isa drove the truck ahead, while George, Gabriella, Wolverine, Caliban, and Professor X, along with the children, sat in the back shed, discussing their next destination. After some discussion, they summarized the following points. First, they couldn't stay in the city center, as this would easily expose their location and attract the attention of the government and Arclay Genetics. Secondly, their location couldn't be too remote, as neither the children's education, the professor's necessary medication, nor their daily needs could be met in such a place. Also, it would be difficult to raise money in a remote area. If they weren't going to rescue Tony Stark, they'd need to raise money to buy Stark shares. How to raise money quickly? Normal methods certainly wouldn't work. The saying murder and arson bring wealth naturally refers to robbing others, such as criminal businessmen and gangs. Remote areas have few people, let alone wealthy ones, so they wouldn't be able to raise much money. Thirdly, they couldn't be too far from New York. On one hand, they needed to continue monitoring Tony Stark's news and be ready to launch a rescue plan at any time. On the other hand, George had another reason. New York was a hub for major events, especially with a Chitauri invasion in a few years, so he needed to be nearby for convenient observation. If nothing happened, he wouldn't need to get involved, but if something unexpected occurred, he needed to prepare in advance. Otherwise, if he was practicing magic one day and the entire Earth collapsed, he wouldn't survive. Actually, we can go back to school, back to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, Professor X suddenly said after summarizing. However, Wolverine's expression changed upon hearing this, and he immediately objected. No, it's too dangerous. The government is still after you. Going back to school would be like walking into a trap. Actually, he wasn't worried about the government's pursuit. After all, that was 25 years ago. They hadn't shown their faces in 25 years, the government leaders had probably changed several times over, and the current officials likely thought they were dead. What he worried about was that if they returned to New York, returned to the school, the professor would recall those deliberately sealed memories, remembering that he had killed all the mutants in the entire school. Upon hearing this, Professor X's eyes instantly welled up with tears. Logan, do you know, while you were fighting just now, I remembered everything that happened back then. Given the crimes I committed, I shouldn't have continued living. But now, I want to live, not for myself, but for these children. I want to properly heal my regenerative abilities. I want to protect the hope of these mutants, and atone for the sins I committed back then. At this point, Professor X choked up and continued, that brainwave chamber that Beast made in the school's basement, once sealed off and activated with a special switch, can block my brainwaves. That way, If an accident occurs and I lose control again, the same tragedy won't happen. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 22: Xavier's Academy of Geniuses. Professor, this isn't your fault. You didn't do it on purpose. Just like the lessons you taught us, it applies to you too, Wolverine sighed, offering words of comfort. Back then, the reason mutants were feared by humans wasn't solely due to a small number of mutants using their abilities to commit crimes. Most of the time, it was because when mutants first displayed their abilities, their inner fear prevented them from controlling them, leading to the deaths of their loved ones and innocent bystanders. Every time these mutant children were brought to school, the professor would provide them with psychological counseling, helping them to muster the courage to start a new life. In truth, the professor, like those children, suffered from epilepsy that caused his brain to malfunction, leading to that tragedy. He himself felt more pain than anyone else. I'm not a child. Having made a mistake, I must bear the consequences. I can't undo the deaths, but I can try to make the lives of the living better. The professor looked at the group of children before him, a smile returning to his face. If it weren't for seeing these children, which rekindled hope within him, he probably would never have been able to confront his painful memories, living a life of despair until his death. But Professor, so many years have passed. That school must have been taken over by the government long ago, George said. Xavier's Academy for Gifted Youngsters was indeed well located, in the suburbs of the Bronx, not too remote, but still some distance from Manhattan, the hotspot for crime. Even if the Chitauri invaded, it wouldn't reach there. Most importantly, as far as he knew, the Bronx was the northernmost part of New York City, the most chaotic borough in the entire city, predominantly inhabited by people of African and Latin American descent. If Hell's Kitchen was the most chaotic part of Manhattan, a wealthy area, then the Bronx was the most chaotic part of all of New York. Various gangs were rampant, and its crime rate was among the highest in the United States. Such a place was perfect for him to fish in troubled waters and make money. Even if he killed someone, it wouldn't attract the government's attention. But, after all these years, how could such a large castle still be empty? Professor X wiped away his tears and explained, although I'm wanted, it's not an open warrant. The government doesn't want to make a big deal out of it, and they don't have enough evidence to arrest me. So, outwardly, my identity remains, and most of my assets are still there, including that castle. It's just that I can't show myself or access any of my assets, otherwise the government could follow those clues and find and arrest me. I see. George wasn't familiar with this aspect, but after Professor X's explanation, he roughly understood. Professor X's secret identity was the principal of the mutant school, but outwardly he was the heir to the famous Xavier family, a true capitalist. In some ways, he was even more influential than Stark Industries. Stark Industries' rise was mainly due to Tony's father, Howard, and before that, it wasn't actually a very large corporation. But the Xavier family was a long-established noble family with a long history and deep roots. Without solid evidence, openly arresting the heir of the Xavier family and confiscating all of the Xavier family's assets would create a sense of crisis among all the old capitalists. Because if you can find a reason to arrest the Xavier family today without evidence, you can find one tomorrow, and everyone will be in a state of fear. And can the government produce concrete evidence that the professor committed murder? Of course not. The professor suffered from epilepsy, his brain went out of control, and he directly used his mental powers to kill those around him. Even the surveillance footage shows people suddenly collapsing and dying, making it impossible to prove that the professor was the killer. On the other hand, the negative impact must be considered. If it's confirmed that the professor, who had helped the government handle numerous crises and was repeatedly received by the president and awarded prizes, suddenly killed so many people, the government would also bear responsibility, its influence would decline, and even the president would be greatly affected. Therefore, at that time, only covert arrests and detentions could be carried out, the matter couldn't be made public, and the entire incident was deliberately downplayed. If that's the case, it's actually a pretty good option, George thought carefully and agreed with Professor X's suggestion. The Westchester incident occurred 25 years ago, in 1984, when Tony Stark was only 15 years old and had just entered the undergraduate program in electrical engineering at MIT. Captain Marvel, Carol Danvers, wasn't even a pilot yet. Nick Fury was just a regular SHIELD agent, and Star-Lord Peter Quill was only 6 years old with his mother still alive. So, the mutant school might really have been left unattended. The police sent by the government to search for them probably wouldn't have even discovered the basement beneath the school. I have no objections, as long as the children are safe, Gabriella agreed, raising her hand. She figured that since the professor and George thought it was feasible, it should be fine. She was just a relatively inexperienced Mexican nurse. Her job was to take care of the children, not to offer unsolicited opinions. She knew her place perfectly well. Seeing everyone agree, Wolverine stopped objecting. He, too, longed to go back to the school. It had once been his haven. As for Caliban, he would go wherever the professor and Wolverine were, regardless of the specific location. So, the truck changed direction and headed towards New York. Because there were so many children, none of whom had legal status, they didn't enter any cities along the way, only buying supplies in small towns and resting in remote areas when they got tired. After 2 days, they finally arrived in the Bronx, upstate New York. Perhaps because he had faced his condition more honestly, the professor's condition had improved slightly. Although he couldn't use his powers as before, he could occasionally influence the thoughts of ordinary people without much trouble. This made their journey much smoother. To avoid being tracked, they changed vans several times. They sold one van to a second-hand market, then bought a different model from another, constantly switching between them. Upon arriving in the Bronx, they didn't go directly to the school that the professor's 4 garden castles had converted into. Instead, George and Wolverine disguised themselves and scouted the place first. As the professor had predicted, it remained empty and unoccupied, though it looked quite dilapidated due to the long period of neglect. Confirming the school was safe, they quietly sneaked in with the children at night and moved into the castle's basement. The castle's basement had 2 floors. Besides the professor's brainwave amplification room and the former X-Men training room, there were a dozen or so spare rooms, enough for everyone to make do. Chapter 23: X-Fighter and Modified Motorcycles. There's still a plane. George was completely stunned, staring at the X-Jet before him. He hadn't expected it to still be in the school's basement. He'd assumed Wolverine and Professor X had taken it long ago during their escape. Wolverine took off his suit shirt, changed back into his favorite jacket, and, puffing on a cigar, explained to George, "It's a pity I can't fly. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been in such a mess when we were escaping with the professor." Back then, the professor had lost control and killed all the mutants in the school. To save him, Wolverine drove him directly to the hospital. Although the professor's condition improved, they were now being hunted by numerous FBI agents. If he had known how to fly, he could have taken the professor out of the US to another country for treatment and escaped the government's pursuit. It's good to have one, we'll use it eventually. Only then did George remember that Wolverine not only couldn't fly, but also seemed to have a fear of heights and motion sickness. In the movies, it was usually Beast, Mystique, Storm, Cyclops, and Phoenix who took turns flying the X-Jet. However, this wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Although the X-Fighter was over 20 years old, thanks to the high IQ scientist Beast, it wasn't much inferior to SHIELD's most advanced Quinjet. Not only was it fast, but it could also be stealthy and shield itself from satellite reconnaissance. In the future, if any of them learned to fly, they could use the X-Fighter to evacuate everyone in time if they encountered any danger. For example, the Chitauri invasion of New York hadn't been effectively stopped. By the way, when you go to the city to gather intelligence, you can ride this motorcycle. It's Scott's favorite, it's been specially modified and is 3 times faster than the world's fastest motorcycle. After showing the X-Fighter, Wolverine led George to a seemingly normal motorcycle in the basement. Wolverine, Professor X, and Caliban were too conspicuous and couldn't frequently appear in the city, otherwise they would inevitably be discovered by the government. They could only help in crucial moments. Therefore, the mission to gather intelligence on Tony Stark at Stark Industries in Manhattan would have to be completed by George himself. Looks like Scott had a good eye. George took a test ride on the motorcycle, a satisfied look on his face. Since the journey had gone smoothly, and the Mutant Academy was better than he'd expected, he no longer planned to contact Tony Stark so quickly and expose himself to SHIELD and Hydra. Therefore, he didn't need to go to Manhattan to gather intelligence. nor did he need to kidnap Obadiah to interrogate Tony Stark about his location in the Middle East. However, he still needed to use the motorcycle to go to downtown Bronx to gather information about the local gangs and unscrupulous businessmen. He planned to pull off a big heist in downtown Bronx before Tony Stark escaped. His current plan was to spend the first 3 months diligently studying magic. After 3 months, he would wipe out all the wealthy and powerful gangs in the Bronx, amass a large sum of money, and then buy up Stark Industries stock at its lowest point. Then, after Tony Stark returned and Stark Industries stock rose, he would sell it all. When Tony Stark announces the closure of Stark Industries' weapons division and the cessation of arms sales, he'll go on a buying spree again, instantly amassing a fortune so he and the school's children won't have to worry about money. Of course, this can only be done once. If he's constantly cleaning up gangs, he'll inevitably attract the attention of Kingpin, the ruler of the underworld, and other powerful forces. He's bound to get his feet wet eventually. Doing it too often could expose him and the mutant school. But if he only does one job, he'll run away and never show his face again. In the Bronx, where security cameras are scarce, even Sherlock Holmes wouldn't be able to find him. So this job has to be big. He needs to scout and gather intelligence beforehand. He has a good eye, especially when it comes to women. I used to really dislike that guy, but now I kind of miss him. Wolverine looked at the motorcycle, lost in memories. George immediately understood. He knew that both Cyclops and Wolverine liked Phoenix, but Phoenix ultimately chose Cyclops. By the way, using these facilities in the basement will definitely require electricity. Won't that attract the government's attention? Maybe we should buy some generators. The power supply won't be as abundant, but it'll be much safer. 25 years have passed. The government has probably long forgotten about this castle, let alone been monitoring its electricity usage. But he felt it was best to be cautious. They'd finally found such a good hiding place. If it were exposed, they'd have to find another one. Once he learned the Muggle shielding charm, he wouldn't have to be so careful anymore, and he wouldn't have to worry about the government discovering him even if he reopened the school. You can rest assured about that. The electricity in the 2 basements has been specially modified due to a previous incident. The Beast has added a special power supply system, different from the one above the castle, and has also undergone extensive defensive upgrades. Even with all the facilities running, there won't be any trace of electricity being used. Wolverine waved his hand at George's reminder. That's good. A special incident? Was it the Apocalypse invasion, or William Stryker leading his troops to attack the Academy? George didn't delve into the details. It didn't matter which one it was, as long as he knew it was safe here, allowing him to focus on his magic research. I'll try to gather intelligence outside in my spare time. If possible, I think you and the professor could help guide these children, teaching them how to better utilize their abilities in combat. Finally, George offered Wolverine a suggestion. Since the combat simulation room in the basement was usable, it could be used to train the children in using their abilities. Unlike the crude, amateurish training at the experimental base, true experts like the professor and Wolverine could better develop the children's potential. He didn't expect these children to play a major role in combat in a short time. At least they should be able to protect themselves and not become a burden. Arclay genetics would definitely not let them off so easily. Finding them based on the traces was only a matter of time. What might arrive then wouldn't just be a clone of Wolverine, but perhaps clones of the Professor, Magneto, and Cyclops, among others. Of course, George believed that the clone's strength would be vastly different from the originals. Because, except for some special types, many mutant abilities require development and comprehension to unleash their full power. Just like Magneto, he wasn't that strong when he first appeared. It was Professor X who developed and guided him, allowing him to reach his later power. The clones created by Sandel Rice have intelligence roughly equivalent to toddlers, and their actions are mostly controlled remotely. How could they possibly develop any abilities? In the movies, Major William Stryker, using Wade as his original form and incorporating so many mutant abilities, was still beheaded by Wolverine and Sabretooth. This proves that unless mind control is loosened, clones can't grow to surpass the original. They can only become grunts. But having too many grunts is also a headache. Chapter 24 Heading to King's Cross Station. Actually, even if you hadn't said anything, I had the same idea. In the past, Professor X would never have agreed to let the kids be exposed to combat so early, but now, he'd definitely be more willing to let them have more self-defense capabilities. Wolverine agreed almost without hesitation. At the old mutant school, Professor X's philosophy was that students were just students. They came to school to better learn how to control their abilities and acquire other knowledge. What kind of job they wanted to do and what kind of person they became was entirely up to them. Only adults who genuinely wanted to stay at the school and become X-Men would receive combat training. However, the situation was clearly very different now. To survive, even children had to learn to develop their abilities and learn to fight and protect themselves. If every child had the strength of Little Wolf Girl, they would be no match for the Arclay Genetics Corporation's pursuit. Okay, then get some rest. After inspecting both basement levels, George and Wolverine returned to their rooms to rest. They hadn't had a good rest these past 2 days of rushing around, and now they could finally get a good night's sleep. And so, 4 days later, as usual, George went to the Bronx to gather intelligence. Upon returning, he buried himself in magic research, focusing his evenings primarily on his Harry Potter clone. While his main Marvel self was busy escaping from prison, his clone hadn't been idle. Aside from occasionally hosting Twinks and his colleagues who came to freeload, he was mostly researching magical theory and practicing new spells. Today was an exception, though, as it was September 1st, the day he was leaving for Hogwarts. Peppa, let's go. After setting down the cage containing the giant owl, George locked the shop door, pushed a car full of luggage, and headed out of Nocturne Alley. Peppa was the name he gave his pet owl because it was incredibly voracious. If he hadn't inherited the old wizard's fortune, he wouldn't have been able to afford such a large pet. But despite its voracious appetite, it was undeniably useful. To prevent the shop from being frequented by dark wizards while he was away at school, he had been selling off all the potions and herbs he didn't need at a discount these past few days. However, few of the wizards who came to his shop were easy to deal with. If it weren't for Paige, the giant owl, perched on the shop's rafters, glaring menacingly, they might have pulled some tricks. For example, using a confusion charm to make him unknowingly give away expensive potions. Pushing his cart, which was taller than himself, George walked out of Nocturne Alley and then turned into Diagon Alley. After about a few hundred meters, he came to a seemingly ordinary red brick wall. He took out his wand and tapped a few specific bricks on the wall, and the bricks immediately began to shake. Soon, a wide archway appeared before him. Continuing to push his car through the archway, he entered the famous Leaky Cauldron in Diagon Alley, a wizarding hotel-style bar that combined food and lodging. He had eaten there a few times when he had time. To be honest, the food was mediocre, the environment was mediocre, and even somewhat dirty and cramped. George waved to the owner, Old Tom, and then, instead of lingering at the Leaky Cauldron, went straight to the Muggle Street outside and stood quietly by the roadside to wait. He had originally planned to take the Muggle subway to King's Cross Station, but when Twinks and her colleagues had dined at his place last time, they knew he was going to King's Cross Station today and insisted on driving him there. After waiting for about 10 minutes, an old-fashioned dark green car drove up from a distance and stopped beside him. "Hey, George, you're 10 minutes early." Tonks opened the car door and got out of the passenger seat. George smiled and replied, "I'm used to doing everything a little early, so I don't rush around. That's a good habit, but unfortunately, I've never been able to get into it." Tonks laughed and helped George move his luggage to the trunk. She was a very outgoing and efficient person. Seamless stretch charm. George looked surprised as he watched Tonks easily fit his large amount of luggage and Paige into the small trunk. The unseen stretch charm is a magical spell that can expand the area of space. Wizards proficient in this spell can even expand a small box to the size of a city. The famous magizoologist Newt Scamander, for example, created such an extra-large suitcase. However, this spell is not permitted for private use by wizards under wizarding law. It can only be used on public items approved by the Ministry of Magic. For example, the magical tents rented to wizards from various countries for the International Quidditch Tournament. Of course, that's the general rule. Because this spell is so convenient in daily life, most wizards still use it secretly, as long as they aren't caught red-handed by an Auror. Looks like you've been studying hard lately. This trunk definitely used the unseen stretch charm, but don't worry, this is a Ministry of Magic Auror-approved vehicle. It's a legal modification. Tonks closed the trunk and winked smugly at George. She was still a trainee Auror, but due to her outstanding performance, she was already allowed to use the Ministry of Magic's Auror-approved magical vehicle. Excellent, George gave her a thumbs up. On the surface, Tonks was 19 and George was 11, with Tonks being the older sister. But in reality, Tonk's mental age was 19, while George's was already in his 30s, far more mature than Tonk's. "Good morning, George." After getting into the car, a young wizard in a bright green velvet suit waved and greeted him from the driver's seat. "Hey, you're going to Hogwarts, so we won't be able to get any free meals anymore." "Good morning, Aldo. You can wait for my vacation, it'll only be a few months," George replied with a smile. He recognized this guy. He'd come over for meals with Tonks a few times, was a big fan of his Chinese food, was a classmate of Tonks, and was now a prospective Auror in the Ministry of Magic. Moreover, he could tell that this guy was pursuing Tonks, but Tonks only saw him as a brother. It's true that love can't be forced. Tonks preferred the mature, older type like Lupin, and wasn't particularly interested in the handsome, youthful type like Raldo. Don't listen to his nonsense. Go to Hogwarts and study magic properly. It's really good school. Tonks, sitting in the passenger seat, gave Waldo a light tap on the back of the head, then turned to Kiao Zhi and said. Waldo rubbed the back of his head, seemingly used to it, and skillfully started the magical car, driving towards King's Cross Station. Chapter 25 The Hogwarts Express. I must study magical alchemy properly in the future. Less than 20 minutes later, the magical car stopped outside King's Cross Station. Refusing Twink's offer to take him inside, George pushed his cart, thinking to himself. Actually, the journey from the Leaky Cauldron to King's Cross Station hadn't been smooth. He'd encountered a traffic jam. However, the Ministry of Magic's car had clearly been imbued with high-level special magic through alchemy. Aldo simply pressed a button, and the car seemed to compress, easily passing through the narrow gaps between cars. The spells of this world were wondrous, and the magical items created through alchemy were equally amazing. If he mastered magical alchemy, he could transform the mutant school into a magical castle similar to Hogwarts, where no one could enter without his permission. Station 9 3/4, reaching the partition between platforms 9 and 10, George pushed his cart straight into it. Then, something miraculous happened. He and his cart seemed to have crashed into a transparent water curtain, passing through without any hindrance. The scene shifted, and a very special platform appeared before him. The most striking feature was the deep red steam locomotive, bearing the inscription, Hogwarts Express, departing at 11 o'clock. He had previously read about this magical train in specialized magical history books. To gain a deeper understanding of the magic of this world and to thrive in the wizarding world, a grasp of magical history was paramount. Many methods for learning and breaking spells could actually be found in magical history. Therefore, he spent time each day studying the various history books he had purchased. The Hogwarts Express was built in the mid to late 19th century by a Muggle engineer, a large number of Muggle railway workers, and most of the wizards in the Ministry of Magic at the time. This magical train route also involved the most obliteration charms and the largest scale Muggle expulsion charms ever used in the world. The idea originated from Ottoline Gumble, the then Minister of Magic, who felt it was unsafe and uncomfortable for young wizards to use portkeys to travel to Hogwarts, with many losing their keys each year due to misuse. Inspired by Muggle steam trains, he conceived the Hogwarts Express and its extensive railway route. This move reportedly drew protests from some pure-blood families, but the Minister of Magic forcefully suppressed them by threatening to deny Hogwarts admission to those who refused to take the train. This magical steam train ran between platform 9 3/4 at King's Cross Station in London and Hogsmeade Station, 6 times a year, once on September 1st for the start of school, 4 times for Christmas and Easter, and once during the June holiday. At this time, the steam engine's thick smoke filled the air above the platform. Because George arrived early, there weren't many young wizards or their parents on the platform, and it wasn't noisy. Pushing his cart into the carriage marked first years, George randomly found a compartment, quickly stuffed his luggage onto the overhead rack, and then placed a cage containing the owl in the corner of the compartment closest to him. "Sleep well, don't make a sound and scare the little wizards who'll be here soon," he told Paige. Then, George took out a book, on the importance of basic magical theory, and began to read intently. The journey from London to Hogwarts would take about 5 or 6 hours, he couldn't let it go to waste. As time passed, more and more wizards, both young and old, appeared on the platform outside the window, along with various magical pets. Little wizards also began to enter the compartment. "Wow, is that your pet?" "It's a hoot owl," a little boy with a magical camera around his neck, pushing his cart past George's compartment, was attracted by the enormous owl. Page and involuntarily walked in. He put his luggage in the corner, picked up his magical camera, excitedly took a few pictures, and then introduced himself to George. "Hello, my name is Colin Creevey, just call me George." George looked up at the boy, smiled, and nodded. He recognized the name. The boy seemed to be a huge Harry Potter fan who loved taking pictures of his idol. "George, Colin was lively and talkative, and he sat down next to George very naturally, starting to chatter away. George had no choice but to put away his magic book and chat with him for a few minutes. Through their conversation, he learned that Colin was born into a Muggle family and had a younger brother named Dennis Creevey. Because of his passion for photography, after seeing the magical camera in Diagon Alley, he used the money he had saved for his pet to buy it. His most admired idol was Harry Potter, mentioned in A History of Modern Magic, The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts, and important magical events of the 20th century, who, only a year older than him, had defeated Voldemort, the wizarding world's most feared figure. "By the way, George, after all this talk, haven't you told me anything about yourself?" After a long chatter, Colin realized he knew nothing about George. To avoid further rambling, George laughed and said, "I'm an orphan. I've never met my parents, and I have no family, so there's nothing to introduce." Colin was taken aback, then a look of sympathy crossed his face. He quickly changed the subject. "By the way, your owl is so big, what does it usually eat?" Eagle owls are commonly found in Eurasia and Africa, mainly inhabiting mountain forests, plains, wilderness, forest edges, shrublands, sparse forests, and exposed high mountains and cliffs. They like to eat field mice, rabbits, and pheasants, and sometimes frogs, snakes, and lizards. It's said to be one of the few owl species that can withstand the gaze of a basilisk. Another is the legendary phoenix. At this moment, a somewhat dazed voice suddenly rang out from the doorway of the private room. George and Colin turned to look. It was a little girl with silver eyes and dark golden brown hair. Her skin was very fair, and her eyes were large, but her gaze was unfocused. Therefore, her overall demeanor seemed somewhat ethereal and strange. The eagle owl can be unfazed by the basilisk's gaze. "I don't seem to have seen any mention of that in the books," George asked the girl with some surprise. Having bought the eagle owl as a pet, how could he not have looked up relevant information? He had seen most of the information the girl had mentioned in his research, except for the last point. However, the truth of this last point was quite important, because a basilisk would indeed appear at Hogwarts that year, and it was a 1,000-year-old basilisk at that. Therefore, he had to verify it carefully. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.